Hey guys, tonight we begin with a man trying very hard not to breathe too loudly in a winter wood. Not a noble rebel in a green hood, smiling under perfect leaves. Not a laughing archer with warm hands, full stomach, and a suspiciously cheerful group of friends who all seem to have excellent dental care for the 13th century. We begin with someone colder than the songs promised. His cloak is stiff at the hem. His shoes have gone dark with damp. The snow, if there is snow, is not soft and pretty anymore. It has become a record of movement. Every step writes a sentence someone else may read. And somewhere behind him, perhaps a few miles away, there is a village with smoke rising from real hearths, bread cooling under cloth, animals breathing in sheds, doors barred against the night. That village is not simply home anymore. It is danger, it is memory, it is hunger, it is the place that might save him, and the place that might sell him. That is the first thing winter does to the medieval outlaw. It ruins the romance. We often inherit the outlaw as a summer creature. Green leaves, dappled sunlight, a bow across the shoulder, the forest acting like a loyal friend. Medieval legend, especially in England, gave us the outlaw as a person who slips through the cracks of power and makes a kingdom look foolish. There is pleasure in that image. There is a reason people kept telling those stories. A sheriff outwitted in the trees is one of history's neat little comforts. Bureaucracy rarely looks graceful when it is chasing someone over a muddy ditch. But winter is not impressed by folklore. Winter does not care if a man is brave, charming, wrongfully accused, actually guilty, or merely too poor to survive inside the rules. Winter asks simpler questions. Are you dry? Do you have fuel? Can you sleep without freezing? Can you cook without smoke being seen? Can you cross frozen ground without leaving signs? Can you trust the person who gave you bread yesterday not to mention it tomorrow? Can you stay far enough from people to avoid capture, but close enough to people not to die? So before we wander under the trees, if you enjoy these slow, strange walks through the uncomfortable corners of history, go ahead and like the video. Subscribe if you want more sleepy historical trouble, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. I always like imagining this story drifting into different rooms around the world, very quietly ruining everyone's medieval fantasies at once. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The cold begins in the feet. That sounds too small for a history of crime and law, but it is probably where the truth lives. Not in a grand proclamation, not in a wanted notice nailed somewhere impressive, not in a minstrel's song about justice beneath the trees. The truth begins when water gets through leather, when wool socks or foot wrappings lose their warmth, when a man who needs to keep moving discovers that moving hurts and stopping is worse. A medieval outlaw was not always the same thing as the outlaw of legend. In medieval England, outlawry had a legal meaning. It could describe someone placed outside the ordinary protection of the law, often after failing to answer a court summons. It could also blur, in popular imagination, into bandit, poacher, rebel, fugitive, robber, or heroic resister. The law liked categories. Life preferred mess. Some men were violent. Some were desperate. Some had crossed a lord, fled debt, broken forest rules, escaped service, joined a gang, or simply failed to appear where authority demanded they appear. Some were probably exactly as unpleasant as the records suggest. Others may have been poor men whose crimes look less romantic, but more understandable when you remember that hunger has never cared much about legal theory. And the records themselves are not innocent. They come mostly from people who had desks, seals, courts, and reasons to make fugitives look like problems to be solved. The outlaw's own version rarely survives. He does not leave us a neat diary saying, slept badly under oak roots, stole turnips, regret career choices. History, tragically, is much poorer for that. What we can say is that winter narrowed every choice. In warmer months, the countryside offered concealment, movement, and scraps of abundance. Leaves covered tracks, hedgerows thickened, birds, fish, nuts, berries, herbs, and small animals became part of the mental map of anyone used to rural life. There were temporary shelters for shepherds, charcoal burners, woodcutters, swineherds and travellers. There were lanes and paths that mattered more to locals than to officials. There were people who knew which stream flooded, which hollow stayed dry, which boundary stone marked a jurisdiction someone else claimed to control. But in winter, the land changed sides. Branches opened, underwood thinned, fields lay exposed, ice made sound carry. Snow could betray a path more honestly than any witness. Even without snow, frost hardened ruts and mud, and the whole countryside became a quieter instrument. A snapped twig seemed louder. A cough in the wrong place felt like a confession. Smoke rose sharper in cold air. At dusk, when village fires began to show, warmth became visible from a distance, and invisibility became expensive. The outlaw needed fire, and fire was a terrible friend. Without it, winter could take him slowly, first through shivering, then clumsiness, then bad decisions, then sleep that was not really sleep but surrender wearing a blanket. With it, he could warm hands, dry cloth, soften food, maybe keep fear at a manageable distance. Yet every fire asked to be seen. Smoke climbed through branches, sparks moved in the dark. The smell of burning wood travelled. A hidden camp was never fully hidden if the wind changed. So the outlaw's winter life was built around compromises. A fire in a hollow, screened by brush. A fire kept small, fed with dry sticks, watched like a guilty secret. A fire used at certain hours, or not used at all if the risk felt too high. He might look for the remains of someone else's work, a charcoal burner's site, a shepherd's hut, an abandoned outbuilding, a cave, a fold in the land where the wind passed overhead. But every useful shelter had the same problem. If it was useful to him, someone else probably knew about it. This is where the forest stops being wilderness in the modern sense. A medieval forest, especially a royal forest in England, was not simply a dense mass of trees where civilization ended. It could include woodland, heath, pasture, villages, tracks, rights, restrictions, deer, officials, grazing animals, and people whose lives depended on access to fuel and land. The word forest often meant a legal landscape as much as a natural one. It was a place where certain animals and resources were protected for elite power, and where ordinary people might find their daily needs tangled in rules written far above them. That matters because an outlaw hiding there was not vanishing into emptiness. He was moving through someone's workday. A forester might pass. A charcoal burner might notice cut branches. A swineherd might recognize a footprint near a winter shelter. A woman gathering sticks might see smoke where smoke should not be. A boy sent after an animal might find the place where someone had slept. The countryside had eyes, not because everyone was loyal to authority, but because everyone had business there. Even silence had a price. A villager who helped an outlaw might do it from kinship, fear, pity, politics, resentment of officials, or the simple old knowledge that a hungry man at the edge of the woods is still a man. But help was dangerous. Bread given in secret could become evidence. A warning whispered too often could become rumour. A barn opened for one night could make a household vulnerable. Mercy, in a hard winter, had to pass through calculation. The outlaw therefore lived in a miserable dependence. He had to avoid society, but he could not fully leave it. The forest might hide his body, it could not bake his bread. It could offer fuel, but not without labour. It could offer animals, but hunting could mean trespass, poaching, and punishment. It could offer water, if not frozen or fouled. It could offer darkness, but darkness also made every sound uncertain. And hunger made everything louder. Imagine him crouched near the roots of a tree, working at a piece of hard bread with cold fingers. The bread is not charmingly rustic. It is a tool for staying alive. Maybe it came from a sympathetic cousin. Maybe it was stolen. Maybe it was paid for with something he could not afford to lose. It is heavy, coarse, and precious. Crumbs fall onto wool and are picked up one by one, because dignity is one thing, but winter has a way of making dignity negotiate. Nearby, the little fire is almost out, not because he is finished with warmth, but because the sky is paling. Morning is dangerous. Smoke is easier to see. People begin moving, the village becomes awake, and with it, the law grows legs. So he presses ash over the embers, gathers what he can carry, and listens. That listening may be the oldest survival skill of all. Not archery, not swordplay, not the proud green freedom of the ballad. Listening. For dogs, for bells, for axes, for voices, for the difference between wind in dead leaves and a person trying to be quiet. In winter, the outlaw survives by becoming less like a hero and more like a nervous animal with a legal problem. And behind him, from the covered place where the fire had been, one thin line of smoke still tries to rise. The body notices first when the day begins to lose heat. A man can lie to himself about danger for a long time. He can tell himself that the sheriff's men are lazy, that the forester will not come this far, that the old woman near the mill will keep quiet, that the path he used yesterday is too faint to matter. But the body is harder to fool. The body keeps accounts. It knows when the damp has reached the back. It knows when hunger has stopped being an annoyance and become a small animal moving under the ribs. It knows when the fingers are no longer merely cold, but slow. For a medieval outlaw in winter, the first problem was not a dramatic encounter with armed men. It was management. Boring, relentless, humiliating management. Heat had to be managed. Damp had to be managed. Hunger had to be managed. Distance had to be managed. Even fear had to be managed, because panic wasted strength, and strength was one of the few things he could not steal twice. The clothing mattered more than the weapon. That is not what the stories prefer. Stories like bows, stories like knives, stories like the satisfying twang of rebellion from behind a tree. But a bow did not keep rain out of the sleeves. A knife did not stop wet wool from chilling the skin after sunset. A man hiding through winter would have cared deeply about fabric, stitching, soles, grease, layers, and anything that kept the weather from turning him into a shivering bundle of mistakes. For poorer rural people, clothing was usually plain and practical. Wool, linen where it could be afforded, leather, patched garments, hoods, cloaks, belts, simple shoes, sometimes wrapped legs, sometimes whatever could be repaired rather than replaced. Wool had the great mercy of retaining some warmth even when damp, though some warmth is not the same as comfort. A soaked cloak is not a cosy medieval blanket. It is a heavy argument draped over the shoulders. It pulls at the neck, smells of smoke and animal, and makes every crouch feel older. The hood was a small civilization of its own. It protected the ears, neck and head, and in a world where much work happened outdoors, that mattered. A hood could also change the shape of a face at a distance. Not magically, not like a disguise in a play, but enough, perhaps, to make a passerby uncertain in bad light. And uncertainty could be useful. Most survival did not require perfection. It required making another person hesitate. Shoes were worse. Medieval footwear varied widely, but for ordinary people it was often thin by modern standards, vulnerable to water and in need of repair. Cold came up from the ground with a patience that felt almost intelligent. Frozen mud pressed through worn soles. Wet leather stiffened. A cut or blister was not a minor inconvenience if walking was the difference between capture and escape. A fugitive could not simply limp into a shop and ask for a better pair, unless he knew the shopkeeper, had money, and trusted silence to hold. So the outlaw's winter map was also a map of surfaces. Mud, frost, frozen field, leaf litter, stream bank, cart road, ditch, pasture, root, stone. Some surfaces held footprints. Some surfaces made noise. Some surfaces stole heat. Some surfaces led toward people, which meant food and danger together. The ground was not background. It was an informer. Then came shelter, which sounds simple until you remember that shelter is usually owned by somebody. A barn was shelter. A byre was shelter. A shed, a charcoal burner's hut, a shepherd's fold, a hollow beside a bank, the lee side of a wall, the ruins of an old structure, the space under thick evergreen growth. All could become temporary shelter, but each one carried social meaning. A barn meant a farm meant a household. A household meant someone who might wake, notice, remember, resent, pity, or report. Even a ruined place might be known by boys, herders, labourers, or anyone looking for lost animals. The best hiding place was often not the deepest wilderness, but the place just neglected enough to be boring. Too close to a road and people passed. Too far from everything and food disappeared from the equation. Too visible and the outlaw became news. Too hidden and he might spend more strength reaching it than he could recover once there. Survival lived in that thin band between visibility and usefulness. A hollow in the land could stop the wind. A fallen tree could break a line of sight. Bracken, if still standing or piled, could make a rough bedding. Straw was better, but straw belonged to someone and had uses already. Bedding animals, stuffing mattresses, covering floors, feeding systems of work that did not appreciate being quietly borrowed by a man with a bad reputation. Dry leaves helped until they became wet. Moss helped until it froze. The earth itself was cold, and the earth was always there, patiently collecting warmth from anyone foolish enough to lie directly on it. That is the detail bedtime versions of outlaw life usually skip. The ground takes. It takes warmth from the hips, shoulders, knees and back. It turns sleep into negotiation. A man might curl tightly, cloak pulled around him, knees drawn up, trying to keep the core warm while his feet complained in silence. He might wake again and again, not from dreams, but from the body's small alarms. A shift in wind, a cramp, the prickle of damp, a sound that may be nothing, a sound that may not. No one is heroic at 3 a.m. with cold feet. Food made the next circle of trouble. The medieval countryside was full of food in the same way a locked pantry is full of dinner. There were animals, grain, stored peas and beans, cheese, ale, pottage, roots, nuts in season, fish in some places, and deer if one wants to leap directly into forest law trouble. But food was embedded in ownership, labour, season and risk. A field after harvest might offer leftovers. A stream might offer fish if the outlaw had the tools, time, permission, or willingness to ignore permission, and luck. A snare might catch a rabbit or bird, though the legal and social risks varied. Stored grain was more reliable, but stored grain was watched because it represented winter survival for households that were not exactly living in luxury themselves. Stealing from a rich lord sounds clean in legend. Stealing from a poor household in February is different. It is not a merry redistribution scene. It is one hunger reaching into another hunger's cupboard. That does not mean outlaws never did it. Desperation rarely produces tidy ethics. But it changes the emotional temperature of the story. Winter crime was not always velvet rebellion against a greedy official. Sometimes it was a man in the dark, deciding that his own stomach was louder than another family's mourning. More likely, survival depended on mixed sources. A little theft, a little poaching, a little charity, a little trade, a little kinship, a little intimidation, a little luck. Perhaps a sympathetic villager left food near a boundary marker. Perhaps a relative passed along bread under the excuse of visiting another farm. Perhaps a tavern keeper looked away. Perhaps a monk or lay brother at a religious house gave alms without asking too carefully who had come to the gate. Perhaps a group of fugitives pooled knowledge and risk because being alone was safer for secrecy, but worse for work. That balance mattered. One person leaves fewer traces. 2 people keep better watch. 3 people can gather wood, scout, and sleep in turns. 4 people need more food. More food requires more contact. More contact creates more rumour. Rumour is snow that falls indoors. And rumour travelled differently from footsteps. It did not need a visible track. It moved through mills, markets, alehouses, churchyards, kitchens, wash places, and fields where people pretended not to gossip while doing nothing else quite so efficiently. A stranger seen near the wood, a missing loaf, a dog barking after dark, a child saying something at the wrong time, a wife noticing her husband cut an extra slice of bread and asking no question until later. these are small things. But medieval local life was made of small things. People knew who belonged where. A man out of place was not invisible just because he was poor. The outlaw might know this better than anyone. He may have been from a village himself. He knew how quickly a face became a story. He knew which households feared the Lord, which disliked the forester, which had sons in trouble, which had daughters who listened too closely, which old men remembered every path better than any official map. The same knowledge that helped him hide also reminded him that hiding among familiar people was nearly impossible. So he moved through a landscape that was never only natural. A frozen stream was water, boundary, sound, risk, and maybe a way to confuse tracks. A church bell was time, community, warning, and distance. A mill was food, gossip, labour, and surveillance. A woodpile was warmth, ownership, and evidence. A deer was meat, law, elite privilege, temptation, and possibly a rope tightening somewhere in the future. Even darkness was not empty. It was crowded with rules. By late afternoon, when the light thinned and the cold began sharpening again, the outlaw's day narrowed toward the same old question. Where can a living body disappear without dying? Not forever. Forever was too large. The winter did not have to be defeated forever. It only had to be survived one more night. He would look for the place where wind dropped. He would think about whether the smoke would show. He would listen for carts, dogs, axes, voices, bells. He would touch the bread, if there was bread, and count without numbers how long it might last. He would pull damp wool closer and tell himself that tomorrow could be managed after tonight. And somewhere beyond the trees, the village hearths would begin to glow again, each one a little square of warmth belonging to someone still inside the world. The village hearths mattered because the law was not simply a distant thing written in Latin and carried by officials with stern faces. Law lived in the way people looked at each other. A man might be declared outside the law by process, but he did not become invisible to the human world. If anything, he became more visible in the wrong way. His absence had a shape, a field not worked, a rent not paid, a court summons not answered, a wife questioned, a brother watched, a neighbour suddenly careful with his words at the ale bench. The outlaw was missing from the village, and missing people can take up more space than present ones. In medieval England, outlawry was not just a mood. It was not simply someone deciding to live boldly beyond authority. It could be a formal legal condition, reached after repeated failure to appear before a court. Once pronounced, it carried severe consequences, especially for men accused of felony. The details changed across time and procedure, and the reality on the ground was messier than any legal formula, but the meaning was frighteningly clear. The person had been pushed outside ordinary protection. In a world where protection was not an abstract right floating gently over everyone, that mattered. To be outside protection was to become a problem others could handle harshly. The songs later made this sound almost glamorous. Outside the law meant free, green, laughing, quick with a bow, rude to sheriffs, beloved by poor people, and generally excellent at woodland banter. But the legal condition was darker and colder. It meant your property might be seized. It meant your social ties became dangerous. It meant appearing openly could invite arrest. It meant the road, the market, the church door, the mill, and the ordinary pathways of life turned against you. And this is where winter tightened the trap. A summer outlaw could sometimes pretend that distance was a kind of safety. He could sleep farther out, move under leaf cover, find more food, risk more wandering. Winter pulled him back towards settlements, because winter stored survival indoors. Grain was in barns, salted meat, where it existed, was in houses, manors, monastic stores, or market systems. Tools were indoors. Dry straw was indoors. Warmth was indoors. Even news was indoors, moving from mouth to mouth near fires. So the outlaw had to orbit the village like a hungry moon. Too close and he could be seen, too far and he starved. The distance was never fixed. It changed with weather, with patrols, with family loyalty, with rumour, with the temper of local officials, with whether anyone had recently lost a sheep and decided that justice would be more satisfying if it had a face. The official machinery of law had limits. Medieval administration was not a modern police system with radios, patrol cars, photographs and databases. A fugitive could survive partly because the world moved slowly. Roads were bad, messages took time. Identification depended on memory, reputation, clothing, scars, speech, and local knowledge. A man could sometimes cross into another jurisdiction, hide among labourers, use a false name, or take advantage of the simple fact that most people had their own miserable work to do. But slowness did not mean softness. Medieval communities could be intensely watchful. People knew one another because they had to. They shared fields, wells, ovens, churches, grazing, labour obligations, disputes, debts, marriages, gossip, and grudges with a level of closeness that would make many modern people throw themselves peacefully into a pond. Strangeness announced itself. A new man at the edge of a village, a familiar man appearing at the wrong hour, a woman carrying more bread than usual toward a hedge line, a child told not to speak of something. These details could harden into suspicion. And suspicion was its own weather. The outlaw's greatest enemy was not always the sheriff. Sometimes it was the tiny social fact that someone had noticed. Notice could become talk. Talk could become pressure. Pressure could become testimony. Testimony could become pursuit. A name spoken near the wrong person could travel faster than a man limping through frozen mud. If the outlaw had once belonged to the area, his knowledge of the landscape came with the curse of being known by the landscape's people. This made kinship both shelter and snare. A brother might help. A cousin might hide him for a night. A wife might pass food, though records tend to leave such intimate risks in shadow unless the law dragged them into view. Friends might warn him when officials came asking questions. Yet each act of help created danger for the helper. Medieval households were not private fortresses of personal freedom. They were embedded in obligation. Lords, courts, neighbours, priests, reeves, foresters, and local reputation pressed on them from every side. Imagine a small house after dark, smoke caught in the roof, bodies close together because space is limited and privacy is a luxury. Someone knocks softly, not at the front in a normal way, but where a known hand can be recognised. The family freezes. They know the rhythm. They know who it is. They also know what it means. There is no dramatic speech. Real fear often makes poor theatre. Maybe a woman takes bread from a shelf. Maybe an older man curses under his breath, not because he has no pity, but because pity now has consequences. Maybe a child is told to turn away. Maybe someone opens the door only wide enough for cold air and a hungry hand. This is not the outlaw fantasy of generous villagers joyfully supporting a forest hero. Sometimes that may have happened, especially when an outlaw had local sympathy or when authority was hated. But often help would have been quieter, more reluctant, more complicated. People do not need to adore a fugitive to help him. They may help because he is kin, because he knows something about them, because they fear him, because they dislike the officials more. Because hunger at the door is hard to refuse when the face belongs to your own world. That is the uncomfortable part. Survival depended on relationships that were rarely pure. Even the forest law that shaped parts of medieval England carried this double quality. Royal forests were not simply wooded parks for pleasure. They were legal zones designed to preserve hunting rights, especially deer and the habitat that supported them. For ordinary people, this could mean restrictions on taking game, cutting wood, clearing land, grazing animals, or using resources they might feel they needed. Enforcement varied, and not every forest was the same. But the basic tension was sharp. Elite privilege could turn hunger, fuel, and land use into punishable acts. For an outlaw, that world was full of temptation. A deer in winter was not a symbol. It was meat walking on delicate legs. But it was also evidence on hooves. Killing large game required tools, skill, help, time, and a way to butcher and move the carcass. Blood marked ground. Dogs might follow scent. Meat had to be hidden, cooked, shared, traded, or preserved. Antlers, hide, bones, tracks, disturbed snow, disturbed people. Nothing about a deer disappeared neatly. Small thefts could be safer but less satisfying. A hen, a loaf, a bundle of sticks, a handful of beans, some turnips, a strip of cloth. These things do not sing like ballads. No one builds a legend around a man nobly stealing damp firewood and half a cabbage. But that is often the scale on which survival actually lives. History is full of small, ugly errands that later memory politely edits out. There may also have been organised groups, men who moved together and used force more openly. Some were feared for good reason. Rural banditry could be violent, and people living near roads or woods had reasons to be anxious. A cosy script should not turn every outlaw into a misunderstood hero with cheekbones and principles. Some were predators. Some robbed people who were barely better off than themselves. Some used the cover of woodland and weak enforcement to hurt others. To say that winter survival was difficult is not to make every fugitive noble. But it does explain why violence and dependence often grew from the same root. A hungry man who cannot enter the village openly may beg, bargain, steal, threaten, or rely on old loyalty. A household that helps him may be compassionate, afraid, complicit, trapped, or all four before supper. A local official who hunts him may be enforcing law, protecting property, settling scores, defending elite privilege, or proving usefulness to someone above him. In a small community, motives do not arrive cleanly dressed. The outlaw survives then inside a web of pressure. Law presses from above, hunger presses from within, weather presses from everywhere, community presses from all sides. And the forest, far from being a free kingdom, becomes the place where all these pressures meet under bare branches. By the time night comes again, he may have food, but food has history on it. Someone baked it, stored it, risked it, lost it, or surrendered it. He may have firewood, but wood has ownership on it. Someone had rights, or claimed rights, or feared someone who claimed rights. He may have shelter, but shelter has memory around it. Someone built it, someone knows it, someone may come back. Nothing is just a thing. The cloak is a record of weather. The path is a record of movement. The bread is a record of obligation. The smoke is a record of life trying not to be seen. And as the outlaw settles again into whatever hollow he has chosen, the whole medieval world seems to gather around that little hidden place. The king's deer, the lord's rights, the village's gossip, the family's fear, the court's summons, the priest's bell, the frozen mud, the hunger, the ash. He is outside the law, perhaps, but he is not outside the system. The system has followed him into the trees. The system followed him into the trees most clearly at mealtime, because hunger has a way of making every legal idea very physical. By the fourth or fifth day of hard cold, if food was scarce, the outlaw's world would shrink. Not beautifully, not poetically. It would narrow to questions that repeat themselves until they become a kind of prayer with bad manners. What can be eaten? Who might have it? How far is it? What will it cost? Who will notice? How cold will it be after dark if there is no fire? How much strength is left for one more walk? A person with a full pantry can afford to think about morality in clean lines. A hungry person often finds the lines covered in mud. This does not excuse cruelty. It explains pressure. There is a difference, and history is better when we keep that difference alive. Medieval villages were not stage sets filled with cheerful peasants waiting to support a noble outlaw. They were working communities with their own fragile stores, their own winter fears, their own children to feed, their own animals to keep breathing until spring. When an outlaw took food from them, whether by theft, threat, bargaining, or desperate appeal, he was not stealing from an abstract system. He was touching someone's winter. And yet, from his side, the world could look just as hard. The manor had grain. The lord's household had stores. Monasteries might have barns, arms, kitchens, fish ponds, orchards, and organised charity, though never in the endless quantities that legend likes to imagine. Mills handled grain. Markets gathered food and gossiped together. Roads carried carts. Hunting preserves contained animals whose bodies did not understand that their flesh had been legally reserved for people who already ate better than most. So the outlaw's hunger moved across a moral map as much as a physical one. A stolen loaf from a widow's shelf was one kind of act. A deer taken from a royal forest was another. A hen lifted from a poor household, a sack of grain from a tithe barn, scraps begged at a monastery gate, ale received from a cousin, dried peas traded for a stolen buckle, meat shared by a gang after a dangerous kill. Each had a different weight, a different risk, a different story people might tell afterward. And people did tell stories afterward. They always do. The outlaw's best hope was not only to find food, but to control the story of how he found it. If he had local sympathy, his theft might be softened into necessity. If he was feared, the same act became proof of wickedness. If officials were hated, even a crime could become a joke at their expense. If the victim was poor and beloved, the outlaw's reputation could sour quickly. In a world without modern newspapers, public relations was not absent. It was just carried in mouths. One of the strangest parts of surviving winter outside the law is that the body needed routine while the situation punished routine. Eat at predictable places and someone can watch them. Sleep in the same shelter and signs accumulate. Use the same path and prints deepen. Visit the same helper too often and the helper becomes marked. But without routine, survival becomes exhausting. Every day must be solved from scratch. So the outlaw might build a pattern that pretended not to be a pattern. He could move between several hiding places, none perfect. A sheltered hollow near a coppiced wood, a disused shed known to field workers, a bank above a stream, a place near charcoal burners when their absence made it usable, a thicket close enough to the road to hear travellers, but not close enough to be easily seen, a ruin where stones held a little of the day's weak warmth before night took it back. Each place solved one problem and created another. The hollow stopped wind but collected damp. The shed had a roof but belonged to someone. The stream gave water but invited footprints along the bank. The road offered information but also traffic. The ruin hid a body but might attract boys, shepherds, or thieves with the same excellent idea. Medieval survival was rarely a matter of finding the perfect place. It was a matter of rotating through imperfect places before the imperfections caught up. Then there was the problem of cooking. Raw grain is not useful in the way bread is useful. Beans and peas need time. Meat, if obtained, needs butchering, cooking, preservation, or quick consumption. Fish spoils. Stolen food may be bulky. Fire requires fuel. Fuel requires gathering. Gathering leaves signs. Cooking produces smell. Smell is gossip for the nose. A hidden fire in winter might be kept small, but small fires are needy things. They do not give warmth generously. They must be fed with attention, dry twigs, splinters, bits of deadwood, anything that does not smoke too much. Damp wood sulks and announces itself. Greenwood is worse. A large fire comforts the body and informs the neighbourhood. A smokeless fire is the dream of people who have never had to burn bad fuel in bad weather while frightened. If the outlaw had companions, the fire became a social test. Who gathers wood? Who watches the path? Who eats first? Who gets the driest place? Who snores? Who complains? Who knows the safest route? Who is brave in daylight and useless after dark? A group could protect itself, but it could also become a bundle of arguments with footprints. Hunger makes rank, cold reveals character. The man who seems bold when stealing may become dangerous when the food is divided. A group also has volume, more coughs, more movement, more waste, more need, more chances for someone to say something foolish to a villager, a tavern keeper, a lover, a priest, or the sort of friend who collects secrets like firewood and spends them when useful. Alone, the outlaw had fewer witnesses and less help. With others, he had warmth and risk sitting beside him. Some days may have involved nothing more dramatic than waiting. This is hard for storytelling, which prefers action, but winter is full of waiting. Waiting for dusk, waiting for a road to empty, waiting for a pain in the stomach to pass, waiting for wet cloth to dry near a pathetic fire, waiting to see whether the barking dog comes closer, waiting until the person who promised food either appears or does not. Waiting can be more frightening than pursuit because the mind fills the silence. In that silence, every ordinary sound gains authority. Ice shifting in a ditch, an owl, a branch losing its load of frost, far-off church bells, the dull chop of an axe, hooves on hard ground, a voice carried strangely by cold air, a dog barking once, then twice, then too many times. The outlaw has to decide whether each sound belongs to the normal world or to the part of the world looking for him. A wrong decision costs heat, food, and strength. Run too often, and exhaustion does the work of the sheriff. Stay too long, and the sheriff may do it himself. The body under this pressure begins to change, not in grand heroic ways, in small reductions. The shoulders hunch, the face tightens against wind. Sleep becomes shallow, hands become cracked from cold, dirt, and wet. Smoke gets into clothing and hair. The stomach learns not to expect fullness. A man becomes skilled at measuring scraps. How much bread, how much daylight, how much trust, how much lie he can safely tell, how much of himself can be spent before there is nothing useful left. There is an old temptation to imagine medieval people as naturally tougher than modern people, as if discomfort were a native language they all spoke fluently. They were certainly familiar with kinds of hardship many of us are lucky not to know, but familiarity is not immunity. Cold still hurt, hunger still weakened, fear still made the mouth dry. A poor man in the 13th century did not possess a magical medieval organ that transformed misery into quaint authenticity. He suffered in a human body. That matters because the outlaw myth often removes the body. It gives us freedom without wet feet, defiance without toothache, woodland independence without diarrhea, smoke, lice, or the problem of where to sleep when the ground is trying to drink the warmth from your bones. The real winter body drags the story back down to earth. It reminds us that every legal status, every legend, every song about rebellion eventually has to pass through skin. By evening, if he has managed well or been lucky, the outlaw may have a little food, a little fuel, a place not yet discovered, and enough strength left to make the next decision. That is a successful day. Not victory, not glory, just the absence of disaster. He crouches near the fire, if he dares one, and holds his hands close without letting the flames grow. The warmth is too small, but it is still warmth. His cloak smells of wet wool and smoke. Somewhere in the dark, someone else owns the land, the deer, the timber, the barn, the road, the law, perhaps even the story that will be told if he is caught. But for a few minutes, his fingers loosen. For a few minutes, survival is not a principle. It is heat entering the hands. Heat entering the hands did not make a man equal to the people who owned the firewood. That was the quiet lesson winter kept teaching. Warmth looked natural. Food looked natural. Shelter looked natural. But in the medieval countryside, very little of what kept a body alive was simply there for the taking. Almost everything belonged to someone, or was claimed by someone, or was watched by someone who served someone else. A branch could be fuel, but it could also be a right. A rabbit could be meat, but it could also be trespass. A patch of woodland could look empty and still be full of invisible boundaries. The outlaw learned those boundaries with his feet. Some boundaries were marked by ditches, hedges, streams, banks, stones, fences, or the changing texture of a path. Others existed in memory. People knew where one holding ended and another began, where common rights applied, where a lord's claim was strong, where a monastery's land started, where the king's forest law reached like a cold hand over trees, pasture, deer, and undergrowth. A stranger might miss those lines. A local fugitive could feel them everywhere. This is why class mattered so deeply. A noble rebel, with horses, retainers, weapons, kin, and political allies, might become an outlaw in one sense, but his winter did not look like the winter of a landless labourer hiding under wet branches. A knight in rebellion might have access to castles, sympathetic households, armed supporters, and negotiations that could still imagine ransom, pardon, or restoration. His danger was real, but it was shaped by rank. A poor fugitive had fewer cushions between his body and the world. For him, the loss of ordinary place could mean falling through the thin floor of survival. He did not have a great hall to withdraw to, a network of noble cousins, spare horses, or servants who could turn discomfort into someone else's task. He had his body, his knowledge, his relationships, perhaps a tool or weapon, perhaps companions, perhaps nothing reliable at all. When the poor man became an outlaw, the cold reached him faster. Medieval society was not a single ladder with everyone politely standing on their assigned rung. It was messier than that, full of local arrangements, obligations, privileges, customs, quarrels, exemptions and loopholes. But rank shaped what danger felt like. It shaped how much help could be asked for openly, how much violence would be tolerated, how easily a name could travel, and whether capture meant negotiation or ruin. The same act could look different depending on who performed it. A lord hunting deer was exercising privilege. A hungry man taking deer could become a criminal. A powerful household gathering wood might look like management. A poor woman gathering too much fuel in the wrong place could become a problem for officials. A well-born fugitive sheltering with allies might be politics. A peasant hiding in a shed might be theft, disorder, and a warning sign. Law often speaks in universal tones. Winter translated it into unequal bodies. Gender shaped the story too, even when the surviving records make women harder to see. Outlaw legend loves bands of men in the greenwood, and many legal cases do centre on men, especially where felony, public pursuit, and formal outlawry are concerned. But women lived inside the same pressure system. They could be accused, punished, displaced, involved in theft, forced into hiding, or drawn into the risks of helping fugitives. More often, perhaps, they appear at the edges of survival. Carrying food, keeping silence, answering questions, protecting kin, managing households under suspicion, or absorbing the danger brought to the door by men who had lost their place. A wife of a fugitive did not merely worry in a picturesque way by the hearth. She might have to decide whether to deny knowledge, pass food, hide goods, shield children from gossip, negotiate with neighbours, or endure the attention of officials and local men who knew her household was vulnerable. Her danger was not always the same as the outlaws, but it could be just as binding. A man could vanish into the trees. The people attached to him often could not. That immobility gave the law leverage. The outlaw's body was hard to catch if he knew the woods. His relationships were easier to squeeze. Ask the family, watch the house, question the neighbours. Notice who buys more grain than usual. Notice who walks toward the woodland edge after dusk. Notice which dog barks at a familiar footstep. Authority did not need to see every hidden camp if it could make ordinary life around the outlawed tighten. This is where the cosy image of the village as a warm, moral refuge becomes complicated. Villages could protect. They could also expose. They were not made of one opinion. One neighbour might pity the fugitive, another might hate him, another might fear punishment, another might want reward, another might see a chance to settle an old grievance under the respectable coat of law. In small communities, justice and revenge could share a cup at the alehouse and leave by the same door. The poor were not automatically united against power. Hunger does not always create solidarity. Sometimes it creates suspicion. If a sheep disappeared in winter, that was not a minor inconvenience with a rustic soundtrack. It could mean lost milk, wool, meat, breeding value, rent money, obligation, and future security. If grain vanished, it could shorten the lean weeks before spring growth returned. If tools were stolen, work suffered. If a household sheltered a fugitive, others might resent the risk spread across the community. So the outlaw might be seen as one of their own, or as a danger to people already close to the edge. Both could be true in the same week. A man might be helped on Monday because he was someone's cousin, and cursed on Thursday because a hen went missing and the children were hungry. He might be admired for mocking a hated forester and feared because mockery did not feed the neighbours after officials came searching. He might be a symbol of resistance in one mouth and a nuisance in another. Reputation was not fixed. It thawed and froze with events. The authorities knew this, or at least they benefited from it. Medieval enforcement often depended on local cooperation. The central authority might declare, command, summon, or punish, but information had to come from people on the ground. Men of the hundred, village officers, juries, foresters, reeves, neighbours, and householders were all part of a system where law was not simply imposed from far away. It was carried through the same communities it disturbed. That meant every outlaw had to think socially, not just physically. He needed to know who owed whom money, who had quarrelled with the Lord's officers, who hated poachers, who had a son in trouble, who would talk after ale, who feared excommunication, fines, seizure, shame, or being blamed for someone else's silence. He had to read faces as carefully as tracks. A friendly greeting could conceal calculation. A closed shutter could mean fear, anger, or simply a household too hungry to share. The winter forest, then, was not the opposite of society. It was society stripped of walls. Every inequality came with him. Class came with him in the quality of his cloak, the thickness of his shoes, the number of people willing to risk themselves for him. Gender came with him in the labour and danger pushed onto those who remained behind. Law came with him in the claims attached to animals, wood, paths, barns, and bodies. Reputation came with him in stories moving faster than he could safely walk. Even the famous weapon of the outlaw, the bow, belonged to this social world. A bow required skill, practice, strength, maintenance, and access to arrows. It could hunt, threaten, defend, or mark its owner as dangerous. But the bow did not float in legend. It needed wood, string, feathers, iron for arrowheads, time to train, and a world that taught some bodies to use violence, while punishing others for the wrong kind of force. A bow could make a man feared. It could not make him free. Freedom is an easy word to use from a warm room. For the outlaw, freedom might mean choosing where to sleep and being unable to sleep safely anywhere. It might mean escaping one lord's control and entering the control of weather, hunger, rumour, and every person who could identify him. It might mean no longer answering a summons, but having to answer frost every morning. It might mean standing beyond the law, only to discover that law was not the only thing that could close around a throat. And still, there must have been moments when the idea of freedom felt real. A dawn with no pursuers. A successful theft from someone widely disliked. A joke shared beside a hidden fire. A deer glimpsed between trees, not yet meat, not yet evidence, just motion and breath in the cold. The small pleasure of not bowing to a man one hated. The even smaller pleasure of knowing, for one more hour, that no one had found the camp. People do not endure only because they suffer. They endure because suffering is interrupted by sparks. But by winter, those sparks were brief. The cold kept returning to the same lesson. A man outside the law did not float above class, gender, property, and power. He met them more nakedly than before. The world did not stop ranking bodies when they entered the trees. It ranked them by who had boots, who had allies, who had food stored somewhere, who could be punished through family, who could bargain, who could disappear, and who would be remembered only as a troublesome name in someone else's record. As night deepened, the hidden fire burned lower again. Nearby, perhaps, another person sat awake in a village house, listening for footsteps that might come to the back door. The outlaw's winter was not contained in the woods. It spread into beds, barns, kitchens, marriages, debts, and silences. One man hid under branches. Half a village held its breath. Half a village held its breath because secrecy was never only silence. It was labour. Someone had to remember not to say a name. Someone had to explain why a heel of bread was missing. Someone had to pretend that the dog barking after midnight meant nothing. Someone had to look surprised when an officer asked a question that everyone knew was coming. Silence had to be made, maintained, repaired, and paid for. Like a roof in bad weather, It leaked unless people kept working on it. For the outlaw in winter, this hidden labour could be as important as a knife. A man alone in the woods might imagine himself surviving by cleverness, but cleverness needed supply lines. Not grand military supply lines, of course, nothing so orderly. His supply lines might be one frightened sister, one old friend, one resentful tenant who hated the forester, one woman at a bakehouse who wrapped a little extra bread and said nothing, one shepherd who saw footprints and decided the snow was none of his business. This was not an army, it was a pattern of omissions. And omissions can be dangerous. A medieval community could punish speech, but it could also punish silence. If people were expected to report, testify, pursue, identify, or help produce a suspect, failure could have consequences. The exact obligations varied by place and time, and we should not imagine every village as a perfectly obedient machine. But local responsibility mattered. Communities were often expected to answer for disorder within their bounds. A fugitive was not merely a man hiding. He was a question being asked of everyone who might know him. That is why the hidden rule of outlaw winter was not stay away from people. It was use people without becoming too visible through them. That rule was almost impossible to obey cleanly. Food ties you to people. Warmth ties you to people. News ties you to people. Even avoiding people ties you to them because you have to know where they are. A forest path is safe only if you understand who uses it and when. A barn is useful only if you know its owner's habits. A monastery gate offers charity only at certain times and with certain eyes watching. A market road offers movement only if you can pass as someone ordinary. Passing as ordinary may have been one of the hardest tricks. An outlaw was not glowing with criminal light. He might look like any other poor, cold, tired man, which was useful until someone asked the next question. Where are you from? Whose man are you? Where are you going? Why are you carrying that? Why are your shoes so wet? Why did no one see you at church? Why do you not know the name of the reeve? Why are you out after dark? Medieval life was full of belonging signals, and a person who failed them became interesting. Interesting was bad. The safest man in the countryside was often the boring man with a reason. A carter had a cart. A shepherd had sheep. A labourer had a task. A pilgrim had a road, perhaps a token, perhaps a story. A trader had goods. A messenger had urgency. A beggar had visible poverty and an expected kind of movement. The outlaw had to borrow one of these shapes or avoid being seen at all. But borrowing a shape required details. A bad lie frayed quickly. It is one thing to say, "I am going to my cousin." It is another to know the cousin's name, village, road, local saint's day, and why your accent or clothing does not quite match. In a society where many people travelled less than modern viewers do in a week, unfamiliarity could be loud. Not always fatal, but loud. So perhaps he moved at the edges of times when people expected this order. Before dawn, after dusk, in rough weather, around fairs, near roads where strangers were less remarkable, during seasonal labour movements, or alongside people too busy to inspect him closely. Bad weather could hide him. Bad weather could also kill him. This is the kind of bargain winter enjoyed offering. The outlaw also had to manage objects. Objects are cues. A fine knife taken from the wrong person, a distinctive cloak, an animal hide, a church vessel, a tool with a mark, a purse too heavy for a poor man's story, arrows of a type known locally, a stolen horse, a woman's brooch, a lord's venison cut badly and wrapped in cloth. These things carried identity. In a world without photographs, objects remembered. They connected bodies to events. They made stories easier to prove. So survival meant knowing what to keep, what to sell, what to hide, what to break apart, what to burn, what to trade far away, and what was more dangerous than useful. Again, this is not offered as advice. It is a way of understanding the pressure. The outlaw did not simply flee through landscape. He moved through evidence. Even food could accuse. A sudden piece of meat in a poor household during a hard winter might raise questions if someone nearby had lost an animal. Fresh venison had its own smell, its own difficulty, its own legal shadow. Grain ground at a mill passed through public machinery. Bread required baking, and baking required ovens, fuel, timing, and social visibility. Ale took labour and equipment. Cheese came from animals known to households. Medieval food did not arrive anonymously in sealed packages. It had relationships attached. The more we follow those relationships, the less solitary the outlaw becomes. That does not mean he was surrounded by loyal friends. It means his survival passed through many hands, even hostile ones. A man who robbed travellers depended on roads maintained by the society he rejected. A poacher depended on elite hunting preserves producing game. A fugitive hiding in woodland depended on the labour of people who cut, grazed, burned, gathered, and watched there. A beggar at a religious gate depended on teachings of charity, institutional food stores, and the willingness of someone to see poverty before criminality. Even punishment depended on community. Pursuit was not always the dramatic charge of mounted men. It could be slower, meaner, more administrative. A report, a suspicion, a summons, a local search, a group of men required to help, a forester following signs, a neighbour naming a neighbour, a household pressured to explain, a sheriff's officer arriving after the easy moment had passed and the hard questions remained. The outlaw had to survive not one chase, but the possibility of being slowly assembled from clues. A footprint near the stream, a missing loaf, a cousin's nervous answer, a child's careless sentence, a small fire found under a bank, a strip of cloth caught on thorn, a rumour that a man thought dead or gone had been seen near the old road. None of these alone might be enough. Together, they could make a person. Winter helped with this assembly because winter reduced cover. It made absence clearer. It made needs sharper. It made repeated patterns more visible. A fugitive who came for food in July might be one more movement among many. A fugitive who came in January could leave a line of disturbance as clear as smoke. And still, the system had cracks. Local resentment mattered. If royal forest officials were seen as harsh, if a lord was hated, if a fugitive came from a family with deep roots, if the community believed the original charge was unfair, if helping him felt like defending one of their own, silence could thicken around him. People could misremember, they could look away, they could answer exactly and uselessly. They could say he had not been seen, which might be true if one was careful about when one looked. Medieval people were not passive pieces on an official board. They had judgment, grudges, loyalties, humour, fear, and talent for making authority work harder than it wished. A villager could be obedient in public and merciful in private. A forester could enforce one rule and ignore another. A priest could urge order and still feed a hungry man. A reeve could report what he had to report and forget what he preferred not to know. This is where the outlaw's winter becomes morally foggy. He survives in the fog between law and local conscience. Too much law and he is captured. Too much visibility and he is betrayed. Too much pressure on helpers and they abandon him. Too much theft from the poor and sympathy curdles. Too much success and officials pay attention. Too much isolation and the body fails. So he must become a reader of limits. How much can be asked of kin before love turns into fear? How much can be stolen before silence turns into anger? How often can one return before a path becomes evidence? How large can a fire be before warmth becomes a signal? How long can a man remain outside the world before the world either pulls him back in chains or lets him freeze beyond its concern? There was no stable answer, only weather, rumour, and judgment. By now, perhaps, the outlaw has learned to think of every comfort as double-sided. Bread fills the stomach and marks a household. Fire warms the hands and writes smoke into the air. A companion keeps watch and may talk. A familiar path saves strength and deepens tracks. A village offers mercy and memory. Even darkness hides him, only until someone brings a lantern. The hidden rule is cruel because it never allows innocence. To live, he must create risk for others. To spare others, he must risk himself. He is not simply a victim of the system, and he is not simply its enemy. He is a pressure moving through it, forcing everyone nearby to choose how much danger they are willing to share. Late at night, when the village is quiet and the wood has settled into its coldest hours, that shared danger becomes almost visible. A woman lies awake because she gave bread. A man turns over because he lied to an officer. A child sleeps beside a secret he does not understand. A forester wonders whether smoke he saw at dusk was mist, or someone's life refusing to go out. And under the trees, the outlaw cups his hands around the last small heat, alive because several people have decided, for now, that silence is worth more than safety. Silence was worth more than safety until the first person decided it was not. That decision did not need to be wicked. It did not need to come from a villain rubbing his hands by candlelight, delighted to betray a freezing man. Betrayal, in hard weather, could begin as exhaustion. It could begin as fear of fines. It could begin as anger over a missing animal. It could begin with a wife saying, very quietly, that there was not enough bread for the children if another heel went into the dark. It could begin with a neighbour who had helped once and regretted it twice. The outlaw's winter did not collapse only when armed men appeared. It collapsed when the balance of risk changed. At first, a village might absorb a secret, a little bread, a warning, a night in a barn, a lie told with convincing irritation. No, I have not seen him. No, no one passed this way. No, the dog barks at everything. These small performances could hold for a while, especially if the fugitive belonged to the place, or if authority was unpopular, or if the weather itself made pursuit unpleasant enough that everyone quietly preferred uncertainty. But winter keeps asking again. Each return for food enlarges the circle. Each missing thing becomes easier to connect. Each helper becomes more nervous. Each rumour adds a little weight. A secret that is bearable for one night becomes heavy after 10. And if the outlaw is not alone, if 2 or 3 men are hiding together, the pressure multiplies. More mouths mean more theft, more tracks, more smoke, more chances for someone to speak when cold ale warms the tongue and judgment wanders off. Fear also changes sides. At the beginning, people may fear the officials. Later, they may fear the outlaw. A hungry fugitive who once asked may begin to demand. A man with a weapon and nowhere safe to go is not always gentle. Even if he means no harm, desperation has a sharp edge. If villagers start to believe that silence protects him more than it protects them, the moral weather turns. This is one of the places where legend is too tidy. The old Greenwood stories often divide the world into corrupt authority and generous common people, with the outlaw as the cheerful, knife-cutting justice into proper slices. There are historical reasons people liked that pattern. It gives frustration a hero. It lets ordinary listeners imagine that somewhere beyond the hedges, someone is making powerful men look ridiculous. But real villages were not choirs. They were nervous, hungry, practical communities full of uneven loyalties. A man could be sheltered by one household and reported by the next. And once pursuit began, winter gave it its own tools. Snow, when present, was the obvious one. Tracks across a field could betray direction, number, hesitation, even injury. A careful man might use hard ground, stream beds, roads already marked by traffic, or places where animals confused the surface. But avoiding tracks cost time and strength. In deep cold, clever routes are expensive. The shortest way to warmth is often the most visible. Mud could be nearly as talkative. Frozen mud held shapes. Thawing mud kept impressions. A wet footprint on a threshold, a smear on straw, a broken reed near a ditch, a snapped branch at shoulder height. None of these made a modern forensic case, but they made people look harder. And in a small world, looking harder was dangerous enough. Dogs mattered too, though we should not imagine every pursuit as a perfect cinematic hunt. Medieval dogs varied in use and training. Some guarded, some herded, some hunted, some simply made noise with professional enthusiasm. A barking dog did not need to track a man over miles to ruin him. It only had to draw attention at the wrong moment. It only had to say, in the language dogs have always spoken fluently, something is where something should not be. Then men began to gather. Not always many, not always well equipped. Perhaps a forester with local knowledge. Perhaps village men expected to help. Perhaps someone representing a sheriff or lord. Perhaps neighbours who had reached the limit of patience. They would not always rush like warriors in a saga. Pursuit could be clumsy, reluctant, cold, and full of muttering. A man called from his work to search a frozen wood may not feel like an instrument of justice. He may feel like a person missing dinner because someone else caused trouble. Yet clumsy pursuit can still be deadly. The outlaw's advantage was knowledge of cover, paths, and hesitation. His disadvantage was fatigue. He might have slept poorly for days. He might be underfed. He might have wet clothing. He might be carrying stolen food, tools, or a weapon. Running through winter woodland is not graceful. Branches catch fabric. Breath burns. Cold air cuts the chest. A misstep twists an ankle. A stream crossing that seemed clever yesterday becomes a trap today because the banks are slick and the water is a punishment waiting politely below. If he fled deeper into the woods, he escaped people and approached exposure. If he moved toward farms, he approached food and recognition. If he hid, dogs, smoke, footprints, or informants might undo him. If he fought, he became more dangerous and drew harsher consequences. If he surrendered, he trusted a system that had already placed him beyond ordinary safety. Every choice was a narrowing corridor. There is a particular terror in being hunted by people who know your childhood paths. A stranger might lose you. A neighbour remembers where boys used to crawl through the hedge, where the old quarry bites into the hill, where the stream can be crossed on stones when the water is low. Local knowledge could save an outlaw, but it could also arm his pursuers. The landscape had no loyalty. It belonged to whoever understood it well enough at the right moment. If captured, the consequences depended on charge, status, timing, local politics, and legal process. We should be careful here, because medieval law changed across centuries, and not every fugitive met the same fate. Some might be imprisoned, some might face trial, some might seek sanctuary under certain conditions, some might be pardoned, especially when politics made mercy useful. Others, especially those accused of serious felonies or violent crimes, faced grim outcomes. The point is not that capture always ended the same way. The point is that capture returned the outlaw's body to a world eager to make an example of disorder. And examples mattered. Punishment in medieval society was not only about the person punished. It was a message sent through everyone watching, everyone hearing, everyone retelling. Law needed memory. A fugitive caught after winter hiding could become a story officials wanted repeated. This is what happens when summons are ignored, when deer are taken, when roads are unsafe, when neighbours shelter the wrong man, when the king's peace is treated as optional. But communities made their own counter-stories. A captured outlaw might become proof of justice, or proof of cruelty. A man hanged for robbery might be remembered with fear, relief, pity, or resentment. A poacher punished harshly might become a symbol of elite greed. A violent bandit might become a warning mothers used at dusk. A local man believed wronged by officials might continue living in whispers long after the records finished with him. Law could seize the body. It could not always control the meaning. That uncertainty gave later legends room to grow. Somewhere between the frightened fugitive and the beloved outlaw hero, memory began to edit. It removed the bad thefts and kept the clever ones. It softened hunger into independence. It changed dangerous armed men into merry companions. It turned desperate woodland camps into a free society under leaves. It made winter less wet. It made smoke less visible. It made villagers more loyal, sheriffs more foolish, and survival more like justice than necessity. But winter, if we let it speak, tells a colder story. A man hiding from pursuit after betrayal does not feel like a symbol. He feels the stitch in his side. He hears men behind him, or thinks he does. He tastes blood or cold metal in his mouth from breathing too hard. He has to decide whether to drop what he carries. He has to decide whether the hollow ahead is shelter or a dead end. He has to decide whether the person he sees near the tree line is a friend, a stranger, or the end of the story. And the cruelest part is that the chase may not look dramatic from outside. A few figures crossing pale fields, a dog barking, a man stumbling through brush, smoke from abandoned embers thinning into the air, someone at a cottage door watching and then stepping back inside because there are children near the hearth and no one wants trouble brought any closer. A distant bell measuring time, as if time has no opinion. The outlaw runs, or hides, or turns, or waits. Behind him is the village that kept him alive until it could not, or would not. Ahead of him is the forest that hides him until it becomes too cold, too bare, too honest. Above him, winter light has the washed-out colour of old bone. Underfoot, the ground records what it can. And for the first time in many nights, the little hidden fire is not his greatest danger. The absence of smoke is. The absence of smoke meant the fire had either died, been smothered, or been abandoned in haste, and all three possibilities had a different kind of cold inside them. A dead fire meant failure, a smothered fire meant fear, an abandoned fire meant movement, and movement in winter was never neutral. Movement spent strength. Movement wrote marks into snow, mud, bracken, frost, and memory. Movement asked the body to perform hope when the body might prefer to curl itself into the smallest possible shape and become nobody's problem until morning. Yet sometimes movement was the only way to live. By this point in a hard winter, the outlaw's survival was no longer just about hiding from men. It was about not becoming predictable to the entire season. A camp used too often gathered signs. Ash darkened the ground. Branches vanished nearby. Footpaths appeared where no path should be. Bits of bone, peel, thread, straw, or trampled leaves made a place begin to confess. Even careful men leave a little biography behind them. The forest reads slowly, but it reads. So the camp had to change. Not dramatically. Not with a heroic march into deeper wilderness under a swelling musical score. More likely with a miserable gathering of things at dusk. A scrap of cloth, a knife, a little bread, a cord, a patched cloak, perhaps a bow, perhaps a staff, perhaps stolen goods too useful to abandon and too dangerous to keep. The outlaw would take what he could carry and leave behind what weight decided for him. Winter makes a strict accountant. It does not care what an object means to you if your legs cannot pay for it. He might move toward another known hollow, another abandoned structure, another fold of land where the wind failed to reach with full authority. If he had companions, the movement became more difficult. Someone lagged, someone argued, someone stepped where he should not, someone coughed. Someone had an opinion about direction, and opinions are heavier when everyone is hungry. But this is also where the story needs to breathe. Because if we only picture terror, we miss the intelligence involved. Survival was not simply suffering stretched over time. It required skill, memory, timing, and an intimate knowledge of ordinary systems. The outlaw was not a modern camper dropped into the past with a shiny knife and a motivational channel. He was, in many cases, a person formed by the countryside. He may have known the smell of weather before rain. He may have known which wood burned hot and which only complained into smoke. He may have known how far a bell could carry on cold air, where frost stayed in the shade, where cattle paths made easier walking, where streams could be crossed without soaking the legs, and which households baked on which days. That knowledge did not make winter kind. It made winter negotiable. And negotiation, in this world, was a form of intelligence often ignored by grand history. We remember kings deciding things. We remember battles, charters, rebellions, coronations, sieges, and deaths in rooms with tapestries. But most human survival has always happened at the level of deciding whether the damp wood is worth carrying, whether the sky will hold, whether the stranger's glance means suspicion, whether the dog heard you, whether the next ridge is worth climbing before dark. The outlaw's mind would have been full of these small calculations. A sheltered valley might be warmer, but smoke could collect. Higher ground might stay drier, but the wind could scrape sleep down to nothing. Near water was useful, but banks recorded prints. Near a road meant news, but also witnesses. Near a village meant food, but also recognition. Deep woodland meant cover, but also hunger. A ruined wall meant protection from wind, but also a known landmark. Nothing was safe. Some things were useful. That distinction mattered. A person with options seeks safety. A person with very few options seeks usefulness, and hopes danger arrives late. There may have been moments of unexpected help from the land itself, not the generous greenwood of legend, but the rough, grudging assistance of winter terrain. A hard frost could make marshy ground passable. Fog could soften distance. A storm could keep officials near their own fires. Snow could reveal tracks, yes, but falling snow could also erase them if one was lucky with timing. High winds could break scent and sound. Bad weather could act as an accomplice, though always the sort of accomplice who might kill you after helping. Even cold had uses, if one understood it. Frozen meat kept longer. Frozen ground sometimes made travel easier than mud. Bare trees improved sightlines for the outlaw as well as the pursuer. A quiet winter night made approaching footsteps more audible. The same season that exposed him also sharpened his senses. Survival came from using every hostile thing twice. This is the midpoint of the winter story, where the outlaw stops being merely a figure acted upon by law and weather and becomes a tactician of discomfort. Not a hero, not necessarily a good man, but a person forced to study the world with frightening attention. He might know how to break up a camp so that signs looked old, or at least less meaningful. He might scatter ash, cover marks, step on harder ground, move under trees where less snow lay, cross a stream to complicate pursuit, or walk briefly in the tracks of animals, carts, or other people. We should be careful not to turn this into a list of perfect techniques. The evidence does not let us watch one outlaw's hands in exact detail, but common sense, rural knowledge, hunting practice, and the demands of being pursued all point toward a life of managing traces. Traces were the winter's writing system. And if the outlaw had grown up under labour, he already knew that bodies leave records. A field tells who has worked it. A tool tells how it has been held. A path tells who uses it. A hedge tells who cuts it and who neglects it. A barn tells if someone has slept where animals usually do. Nothing in rural life was blank. The outlaw's problem was not learning that the world recorded him. It was learning to make the record confusing. Still, even confusion required energy. This is why food returns again and again like a rude chorus. Every clever decision costs calories. Every extra mile costs bread. Every hour spent awake guarding a fire costs the strength needed tomorrow. Every cold night draws from the body's hidden stores. Starvation does not always announce itself as dramatic collapse. It can begin as bad temper, poor judgment, slow movement, weaker grip, careless footing, a failure to notice what yesterday would have been obvious. Winter kills intelligence before it kills the body. That may have been one of the outlaw's greatest dangers. The very skills needed to survive became harder to use as hunger and cold accumulated. A man who could read tracks well when fed might miss something after 3 bad nights. A man who knew how to keep silent might snap at a companion. A man who could judge distance might misjudge dusk and find himself between shelters after dark. The margin shrank. Mistakes became easier. Consequences became faster. So renewal, when it came, might have been humble. A full meal, a dry pair of wrappings, one night in a barn where the animal's warmth rose around him like mercy with a smell. A priest's servant who gave pottage and asked no name. A thaw that softened the ground but made travel possible. A companion who returned with bread. A cousin who risked one more warning. A hollow tree that blocked the wind better than expected. A stolen cloak that was ugly, lice-ridden, and magnificent because it was dry. Such moments did not transform the outlaw's life. they extended it. One more day was not a small thing. In winter, one more day could mean reaching a safer district, finding a sympathetic household, waiting out pursuit, hearing news of a possible pardon, joining a group, leaving the region, or simply seeing another morning without chains. Medieval life often turned on these small postponements. History likes decisive events, survival likes delays. And perhaps this is where the outlaw's inner world changed. The first nights outside the law might have held anger, panic, disbelief, even a bitter taste of freedom. Later, winter trained the mind toward narrower hopes. Not justice, not revenge, not legend, dryness, food, silence, a place where wind cannot find the gap at the neck, a morning in which no one has followed, a human face that does not harden on sight. The great ambitions of the living can shrink beautifully when the alternative is not living. There is something almost tender in that, though not sentimental. Tenderness in this story does not look like comfort. It looks like a man pressing cold hands around a wooden bowl and not asking too many questions about where the food came from. It looks like someone turning away so he can enter a shed unseen. It looks like a child being told, firmly, that dreams should stay dreams if anyone asks. It looks like damp wool hung near a low fire while everyone pretends the smell is less awful than it is. For a moment, the outlaw is not a category. Not criminal, not hero, not problem, not symbol. Just a body being kept alive by a chain of small, risky mercies. Then morning returns, because it always does. The fire is covered, the bowl is hidden. The borrowed shelter must become innocent again. The outlaw steps back into the cold, carrying warmth that will fade and knowledge that may not. Behind him, someone smooths straw over the place where he slept. Someone opens a door to let smoke out. Someone begins the ordinary day with an extraordinary secret tucked under it. And in the woods, the man keeps moving, not because movement means freedom, but because stillness has begun to look too much like surrender. Stillness began to look like surrender because winter rewarded only certain kinds of patience. There was the patience of hiding, which could save a life. There was the patience of listening, which could hear danger before it arrived. There was the patience of waiting for a road to empty, a dog to settle, a cloud to cover the moon, a household to sleep. But there was another patience that belonged to the cold itself, and that patience was merciless. Frost did not hurry, hunger did not need to shout, wet cloth did not argue. They simply remained, hour after hour, until the will became thinner. This is the deeper contradiction of the outlaw's winter. He had fled the official world, but the official world was not the only authority. Nature did not grant freedom. It imposed rules without trial, without summons, without appeal. The forest might hide him from men, but it also governed him more strictly than any court. He had escaped one system and entered another. The strange part is that both systems used dependence. The law depended on people, witnesses, officers, neighbours, informants, jurors, servants, foresters, men with local knowledge, families who could be questioned, communities that could be pressured. Winter depended on the body, heat, food, water, sleep, skin, breath, endurance, judgment. The outlaw stood between them, squeezed by a human system that wanted him visible and a natural system that punished him for staying hidden too well. If he avoided all people, he moved closer to death. If he approached people, he moved closer to capture. There is no clean wilderness answer to that problem. It is not solved with courage. It is not solved with a sharper knife. It is not solved with the kind of cheerful self-reliance sold later by stories that, like their forest heroes, well-fed and lightly musical. The actual solution, if there was one, was compromise after compromise after compromise, each one morally and physically expensive. A man might stay hidden during the day and creep toward the edge of settlement after dark. That helped with visibility, but worsened cold and fear. He might sleep in daylight, but daytime sleep was shallow when people were moving nearby. He might steal from those least able to pursue him, which was safer and uglier. He might target elite property, which made better legend and worse risk. He might travel farther, but distance ate food. He might remain near kin, but kin drew attention. He might join other outlaws, but groups needed more and left more behind. Every strategy solved yesterday's problem and wrote tomorrow's. This is where the forest became less a hiding place than a kind of rough accounting office. Every comfort arrived with a debt. A night in a barn meant someone might have seen. A warm meal meant someone had risked stores or reputation. A stolen animal meant tracks, anger, and loss. A successful escape meant the search might widen. A merciful silence meant another household now carried fear. The outlaw survived by borrowing danger from others. That may sound harsh, but it is the truth that keeps the story from becoming too pretty. Even when he was pitiable, even when the original charge was unfair, even when officials were cruel, survival outside the law did not happen in a moral vacuum. If someone fed him, they shared his risk. If someone hid him, they shared his exposure. If someone lied, they placed their own household inside the story. The outlaw's cold spread outward, not as weather, but as consequence. At the same time, the community borrowed meaning from him. A fugitive could become a warning, an embarrassment, a grievance, a joke, a local scandal, a secret act of mercy, a symbol of resistance, or a reason officials came trampling through everyone's business. People used him to explain things they already felt. If they hated forest officials, he became proof of oppression. If they feared robbery, he became proof of disorder. If they disliked his family, he became the predictable fruit of bad blood. If they loved him, he became unlucky, wronged, misunderstood, forced out by circumstances that would have broken anyone. The same freezing man could carry many stories at once. That multiplicity matters because medieval outlaw memory was never built from fact alone. It was built from need. Communities needed villains, they needed heroes, they needed cautionary tales. They needed ways to laugh at authority without paying the full price. They needed ways to explain why some men vanished and returned as rumours. They needed stories where hunger had an excuse, where law had a face, where injustice could be mocked, where fear could be given a tune. Winter stripped those stories down to their raw materials. A man hungry enough to risk everything for food is not yet a legend. A household frightened enough to feed him is not yet a ballad. A forester following tracks is not yet a villain. A sheriff's officer asking questions is not yet a fool. But later, when the immediate fear has passed, memory begins to choose. It keeps what can be carried. It drops what is too awkward. It rounds the edges. It gives the outlaw cleaner motives, the officials uglier ones, the village greater unity, the forest kinder weather. And suddenly the miserable winter wood becomes green again. This is not because people were stupid. It is because memory has work to do. A society under pressure often turns ugly survival into usable story. A man who may have stolen bread from poor neighbours becomes, in retelling, a man who took from the rich. A desperate shelter becomes a free camp. A dangerous gang becomes merry companions. A legal fugitive becomes a defender of fairness. The transformation tells us less about what happened on one cold night and more about what listeners wished could be true. They wished power could be tricked. They wished hunger had justice inside it. They wished the forest belonged to the people who needed it, not only to those who claimed it. That wish was not foolish. It came from real pressure. Forest law, lordship, rents, labour obligations, hunger, and the sharp inequality of access to land and game all gave ordinary people reasons to enjoy stories where clever outsiders embarrassed the men in charge. But enjoyment is not evidence. A ballad can preserve a social feeling without preserving a diary. So when we imagine the winter outlaw, we have to hold two truths together. The first truth is that some fugitives were genuinely dangerous. People feared them for reasons that were not invented by propaganda. Roads could be unsafe. Robbery mattered. Violence mattered. Rural households could suffer from men who used desperation or outlaw status as permission to take what they wanted. We should not polish every outlaw into a folk saint. The second truth is that the system calling someone criminal could itself be unjust, unequal, or brutally indifferent to poverty. Laws around hunting, land, fuel, labour, and obedience could make survival harder for people already close to the edge. We should not assume every official record is a moral verdict handed down by wisdom wearing a hat. Between those truths stands the man in the cold, neither cleanly hero nor cleanly monster. That is the deeper contradiction. Outlaw Winter exposes how difficult it is to separate crime from survival when a society makes access to food, fuel, and shelter unequal. It does not erase responsibility. It does not turn harm into innocence. But it forces the question into the body. What is theft when firewood is controlled and a child is cold? What is poaching when deer are preserved for elite pleasure and poor families face lean months? What is mercy when helping a fugitive may endanger your own household? What is law when obedience freezes one person and protects another? These are not modern excuses imposed backward. They are human questions that arise wherever rules meet hunger. By night, the outlaw might not think in such grand terms. He probably does not crouch under branches composing political theory with chattering teeth. He thinks of where to sleep. He thinks of the face of the person who last helped him. He thinks of whether he can return. He thinks of the official who may have asked questions. He thinks of a sound that might have been a dog. He thinks of his feet, because the feet never let a philosophy get too comfortable. Yet his body is where the whole argument gathers. In the cracked hands there is labour. In the wet shoes, poverty. In the hidden fire, illegal need. In the stolen or gifted bread, community under pressure. In the fear of tracks, law becoming physical. In the decision to move again, freedom reduced to the smallest possible unit, not being caught tonight. And if the forest seems quiet around him, it is not empty. It is full of claims. The king's claim, the lord's claim, the village's claim, the body's claim, the cold's claim. Even the dead leaves under him seem to claim the warmth from his back. He pulls the cloak tighter and listens again. Far away, maybe, a bell marks an hour he cannot afford to ignore. Somewhere closer, a branch breaks under weight. It may be ice, it may be an animal, it may be a man. The outlaw waits, perfectly still, caught between the danger of moving and the danger of not moving, between a society that has named him outside and a winter that keeps proving there is no outside at all. Between a society that had named him outside and a winter that proved there was no outside at all, the outlaw faced one of the few doors that might still open without a sword. The church. Not always, not easily, not safely. But in medieval England, sanctuary could matter. A person accused of serious crime might sometimes reach a church and claim temporary protection, and by the later 12th century this could lead, under certain conditions, to a limited period of refuge and possibly abjuration, meaning the person would leave the realm rather than remain for ordinary trial. The details were legal, local, and changeable enough that we should handle them carefully. But the larger point is simple. Even a fugitive running from law might run toward another part of law and hope it held long enough for breath to return. Imagine what that meant in winter. A church was not just belief carved into stone or timber. It was a shape on the landscape. A tower, if the place had one. A bell. A burial ground. A door known by everyone. Cold walls, rushes, damp air, candle smoke, old prayers, the smell of wool, earth, and human breath gathered across generations. For someone hiding under trees, the church might represent the most dangerous kind of safety, public safety. To reach it, he had to be seen. To claim it, he had to stop being a shadow. Stopping was a confession of need. A man who reached sanctuary was not free in the greenwood sense. He was contained, watched, known. His survival had changed form. Instead of hiding under branches, He now depended on procedure, sacred space, local witnesses, clerical authority, and whatever mercy or calculation the legal world allowed. The forest had been cold and uncertain. The church might be cold and certain. Both could trap him. That is the hidden cost of every escape route in this story. Each one led back into a system. Flight into the woods led back to hunger and local dependence. Flight toward kin led back to household danger. Flight across boundaries led back to strangers asking questions. Flight into sanctuary led back to law, only under a different roof. There was no clean exit. Medieval society was not a room with one locked door and a wild open field beyond it. It was more like a net thrown over land, weather, property, belief, and bodies. Tear through one knot and you found another. For the poorest fugitives, even sanctuary could be almost painfully practical. Could he reach the church before pursuers reached him? Would the door be open? Would anyone recognize him? Would his claim be respected? Would the accusation against him leave room for such protection? Would he have the strength to make the journey? A legal possibility is not the same thing as a warm road. And abjuring the realm, where that path applied, was its own strange survival bargain. Leave the land, follow an assigned route, depart through a port, do not stray, at least in theory. It sounds almost elegant when written in legal language, but for a poor winter fugitive, it could mean another journey with bad shoes, little money, exposure, suspicion, and the bitter knowledge that survival now required exile. Mercy could look like being told to walk away from everyone who knew your name. Still, exile was warmer than a grave. The church door reminds us that medieval outlaw survival was never just a contest between outlaw and sheriff. It was a contest among overlapping authorities: royal law, local custom, ecclesiastical privilege, manorial power, forest administration, family obligation, village reputation, and raw weather all pulled at the same body. Modern people often imagine the law as one thing. Medieval people lived among many kinds of claim, and sometimes a desperate person survived by slipping between them. The forest itself was one of those overlapping worlds. Forest law in medieval England did not merely describe trees. It regulated a legal landscape concerned especially with protected game and the habitat that supported it, often summarised by the paired concerns of vert and venison, the greenery and the deer. Forests could include woods, heath, pasture, settlements, roads, and working land, all under special rules that made ordinary use politically charged. For a winter outlaw, that meant a branch was never only a branch. Cutting wood could be necessity or offence, depending on who had rights and where. Taking game could be food or crime, sometimes both at once. Moving through forest land could bring him into contact not with empty nature, but with an entire staff of officials, local resentments, ancient claims, and common rights under pressure. Scholars of forest law and outlaw literature have pointed out that late medieval outlaw stories often twist, parody, or critique this legal world, turning technical restrictions into narrative comedy and social protest. But comedy was easier beside a fire. Inside winter, the absurdity had teeth. Imagine being cold enough to eye a fallen limb the way a hungry person eyes bread. Imagine knowing that the dead wood under your hand might represent warmth for one night, or the wrong witness might turn that warmth into evidence. Imagine seeing deer tracks in snow and feeling, at once, hunger, temptation, resentment, skill, fear, and the ghost of someone else's privilege. The deer is important because it carries the whole contradiction lightly, on narrow legs. For the elite, deer could represent sport, status, lordship, controlled landscape and pleasure. For the poor, a deer could represent meat. For the law, it could represent protected venison. For the outlaw, it could represent all three, plus danger. Kill it, and he might eat. Fail to kill it, and he has spent energy. Kill it badly, and the animal suffers, and the signs multiply. Kill it well, and the carcass still must be moved, butchered, hidden, cooked, shared, sold, or salted. A deer is large enough to save a starving group for a little while, and large enough to attract the attention that might destroy them. This is why small food may have mattered more often than grand poaching scenes. A handful of grain, a stolen loaf, a pot of pottage given by someone who says nothing, a little cheese, a few onions, a strip of bacon if fortune has temporarily lost its mind and become generous. These things lack heroic shape, but they fit inside cloaks and excuses. They could cross thresholds with less noise than a deer carcass. They could keep a body alive without creating a story too large to hide. Yet even the small things had a hidden cost. Every gift trained the outlaw to return. Every return trained someone to expect him. Every expectation became a pattern. And Winter loved patterns, because patterns made the invisible visible. The same was true of water. It sounds basic, almost too basic to mention, until cold makes it difficult. Streams could freeze at the edges. Breaking ice made sound. Snow, where present, could be melted, but melting required heat, and heat required fire. Drinking from the wrong place risked sickness. Following watercourses might help with direction and tracks, but it could also funnel movement into places others used. The body needed water as surely as bread, but water had geography, and geography had witnesses. Sleep carried its own cost. Deep sleep was dangerous. Shallow sleep weakened the mind. Sleeping near companions could provide warmth and watchfulness, but it also required trust. Sleeping near animals in a barn could be warmer, but only if someone allowed it or failed to notice. Sleeping in the woods meant waking cold, stiff, and already behind the day. The body repairs itself in sleep. The outlaw had to survive on repairs interrupted by fear. Even cleanliness became strategic. Dirt itself was normal enough in a hard rural life, but smell could betray closeness to smoke, animals, sweat, or sickness. Lice and fleas were not moral failures. They were common passengers in a world of wool, straw, bodies, and limited washing. But discomfort erodes patience. Scratching, sores, damp skin, and untreated small injuries could turn into distractions that made every other decision worse. A man does not need a dramatic wound to become vulnerable. A blister can change a route. A cough can give away a shelter. A fever can end a plan more efficiently than a sword. The hidden cost, then, was accumulation. Not one disaster, many small deductions. A little less food, a little less sleep, a little less warmth, a little less trust, a little less silence in the village, a little more attention from officials, a little more anger from neighbours, a little more smoke remembered by someone who should not have been looking. By the time capture or collapse came, it might feel sudden to the record and slow to the body. The record might say a man was taken. The body would know he had been losing ground for weeks. So when we imagine him at the edge of a churchyard, or a forest boundary, or a village lane where frost shines faintly in the dark, we should not imagine a clean choice between bravery and cowardice. He is choosing among costs. The church may save him and exile him. The woods may hide him and consume him. The village may feed him and betray him. The road may carry him away and expose him to every stranger's question. He pauses where the trees thin. Somewhere ahead, a bell rope hangs in a tower, or a small church waits under its winter roof. Somewhere behind, the forest holds the cold places where he has already spent too much of himself. He may not think of law as a web, or sanctuary as procedure, or forest rights as political culture. He may only know that every place left to go belongs to something. Even mercy has an owner. Even mercy has an owner, and ownership decides who can afford to be kind. That may be the bleakest truth in this winter story. Kindness was not evenly distributed, because risk was not evenly distributed. A lord could pardon when pardon served him. A wealthy house could feed a stranger from stores large enough to hide the missing portion. A monastery might offer alms as part of religious duty, though even holy charity lived inside budgets, harvests, discipline, and local politics. A poor household, by contrast, paid for mercy out of its own hunger. When the fugitive knocked at the wrong small door, the question was not only whether the people inside had compassion, it was whether they had enough bread to survive their compassion. This is where the human cost stops belonging only to the outlaw. His cold entered other rooms. A woman who fed him might measure the remaining grain differently in the morning. A brother who lied for him might watch the road with dread. An old mother might worry that the household name had become dangerous. A child might learn, too early, that love sometimes means silence, and silence sometimes feels like lying, even when no one has asked a question yet. The family of a fugitive could live in a kind of low weather of suspicion. Not always under constant official pressure, of course. Medieval enforcement varied. Some outlaws disappeared from records into gaps we cannot fill. Some may have moved away, died quietly, joined other communities, negotiated return, or been caught without leaving enough detail for us to reconstruct the path. But where a known man remained near his home territory, the people attached to him were exposed. Their ordinary gestures became readable. A trip to the edge of the wood, a second loaf. A conversation cut short. A door opened after dark. The law could search for a man by watching the people who missed him. That is a cruel form of power, because it turns affection into evidence. It makes love nervous. It makes kinship useful to officials. It asks a household to choose between loyalty to blood and fear of consequence. It does not need to torture anyone dramatically to hurt them. It only has to make daily life unsafe. And the outlaw, if he had any tenderness left under the cold, must have known this. He may have avoided his own family precisely because he loved them, or he may have returned because hunger was stronger than restraint. He may have promised it would be the last time, and perhaps meant it, as people often do when desperation borrows the language of virtue. The last loaf, the last warning, the last night in the shed, the last time a child is told not to speak. Winter is very good at making liars out of sincere people. The cost also touched those who were harmed by outlaws. We need to give them space in the story, because otherwise we risk turning survival into a costume for romance. A traveller robbed on a winter road was not merely an obstacle in someone else's legend. He might be a merchant with debts, a servant carrying goods, a messenger, a pilgrim, a tenant, a woman moving between households, a labourer with wages, a priest's assistant, or a person already afraid of the dark. Losing money, food, clothing, an animal, or tools in winter could matter deeply. Fear itself could change behaviour, limiting travel, trade, worship, visits, and work. A household that lost food did not experience it as a charming redistribution scene. They experienced less food. If violence was involved, the cost widened again. Injury, grief, legal process, retaliation, fear, and stories told to children about which road not to take. Some outlaws, bandits, and armed groups were dangerous in the plainest sense. They caused harm. They did not become harmless because later memory preferred green leaves and clever jokes. A humane history must resist both official demonization and romantic absolution. There is a person on every side of the theft. The fugitive with cracked hands, the widow missing grain, the child with a smaller bowl, the traveller avoiding a road, the cousin lying badly to protect blood, the forester disliked by villagers, but still perhaps doing a hard job in bad weather, the village officer pressed between superiors and neighbours, the priest hearing rumours before dawn, the wife who knows where the outlaw slept and hates him a little for needing her. That last feeling matters. Human beings often love and resent the same person in the same breath. A woman who helped a fugitive husband, brother, son, or lover might not feel like a ballad heroine. She might feel angry, tired, frightened, trapped by his decisions or by the injustice done to him, or by both at once. She might pity him and wish he had never come. She might curse officials and also curse the muddy footprints he left. She might feed him because she cannot do otherwise, then lie awake calculating how much grain remains. History often flattens such people into supporters or victims. Real life gives them more complicated hearts. Children paid too, in ways records rarely respect. A child in a fugitive's household might learn to be careful around names, strangers, and food stores. He might feel excitement at a secret and fear when adults go silent. She might be sent away from the door when someone knocks. They might not understand the legal condition, but they would understand tension. Children are excellent historians of atmosphere. They know when the room changes. The outlaw's companions, if he had any, paid in another way. Shared danger can create loyalty, but it can also produce cruelty. Cold men become impatient, hungry men accuse. A failed theft, a bad route, a noisy cough, a suspected betrayal, a stolen share of food, any of these could turn a hidden camp into a little court without mercy. The group that protects a man from loneliness may also trap him inside other men's fear. There is no need to invent scenes of melodrama. The ordinary pressures are enough. Take one loaf and divide it among 4 men who have walked all day. Watch what happens to friendship. Add cold. Add the knowledge that one of them has a cousin nearby who might help but has not. Add suspicion that another has kept a piece hidden. Add a dog barking in the distance. Add the sound of sleet beginning on bare branches. You do not need a villain. You need weather, hunger, and arithmetic. The human cost of winter outlawry was that it made everybody smaller. Not morally smaller, necessarily, but reduced. Reduced in options, reduced in sleep, reduced in generosity, reduced in the ability to imagine beyond the next meal, the next patrol, the next lie. Even people who acted bravely did so under compression. Their courage was not grand, it was cramped. It happened in low rooms, by dim fires, with someone listening at the shutter. And yet that cramped courage may be the most moving kind. A person with little to spare gives food anyway. A neighbour who dislikes trouble says nothing anyway. A priest's servant leaves a bowl where it can be found and pretends not to notice when it disappears. A forester, perhaps, sees signs and decides they are old. A wife hides a scrap of dry cloth. A child remembers not to speak. These are not clean acts. They may be mixed with fear, resentment, bargaining, and regret. But they are human acts, and they kept some people alive. The record may not honour them, because records prefer names attached to charges. Mercy often survives as an absence. No report made, no witness found, no question answered fully, no footprints followed, no bowl accounted for. History is not good at preserving the kindness that succeeds by leaving no document. So the human cost leaves us with a strange imbalance. Harm is often more visible than help. Arrests, accusations, seizures and punishments enter records. A loaf passed quietly into the dark does not. A silence held for one more night does not. A woman choosing not to wake the whole house when she hears the soft knock may vanish completely. Yet without such unrecorded acts, winter would have killed more efficiently than law. Late in the night, the outlaw may eat food that carries all of this without knowing every piece of it. He may know only that someone gave it, or someone lost it, or someone could be hurt because he has it. He may be grateful. He may be ashamed. He may be too hungry for either feeling to last long. Hunger is not always noble enough to pause for reflection. But after he eats, when warmth returns slightly and thought comes back with it, perhaps the burden lands. A man can be alone in the woods and still feel crowded by those he has endangered. The hidden fire burns low again. Around it, the dark is full of people who are not there. The family at risk, the traveller afraid, the official searching, the neighbour deciding, the child listening, the hungry household missing what he took, the person who helped and cannot take the help back. The outlaw's body is in the forest, but his winter has spread through the community like smoke under a door. And smoke, once inside, is very hard to pretend away. Smoke, once inside, is very hard to pretend away, which may be why later stories worked so hard to let the smoke drift upward and vanish. This is the point where evidence becomes slippery. The medieval outlaw we can document, and the medieval outlaw people wanted to remember, are not always the same man. Sometimes they barely seem related. One appears in court records, legal procedure, accusations, forfeitures, pursuit, and the dull machinery of local responsibility. The other walks through ballads with sharper wit, better timing, cleaner motives, and an apparently miraculous ability to remain well supplied in the woods. One smells of damp wool and fear, The other smells faintly of May leaves, even when he is supposed to be in danger. That does not mean the legends are worthless. It means they are not receipts. A record can tell us that a person was accused, outlawed, taken, pardoned, or punished, though even records have their biases and gaps. A ballad can tell us what people found satisfying to imagine. It can preserve the emotional weather of resentment, admiration, mockery, and hope. It can show how audiences wanted power to be humiliated and cleverness rewarded. But it cannot simply be unfolded like a map of daily life. Songs are not winter shelters. They let in too much warmth. The famous English outlaw tradition, especially around Robin Hood, is a perfect example of this fog. The early surviving materials point us toward a world of forests, sheriffs, disguises, archery, ambush, generosity, conflict with officials, and a hero whose moral shape grew and changed over time. But the tradition is layered. It was copied, performed, adapted, moralized, politicized, and softened. Later versions added details people now treat as ancient essentials. The outlaw moved through centuries of imagination, collecting better manners as he went. A figure who may have begun closer to rough social comedy and outlaw adventure eventually became a noble-hearted champion of the poor. That transformation is itself historical. It tells us something about the needs of later audiences, but it should warn us not to smuggle the polished hero backward into every frozen thicket. The real woods were not Sherwood as a stage set. Even Sherwood itself, like other medieval forests, was not one endless green cathedral. It included working landscapes, roads, settlements, rights, officials, deer, conflict, and ordinary people trying to use land under rules that did not always favour them. When later imagination paints the forest as a free kingdom, it preserves a wish, not a census. The wish matters. The wish says, what if there were a place where law could be mocked? What if the poor had a champion? What if the sheriff could be made ridiculous? What if the trees themselves took sides? Winter answers. The trees mostly took the side of being trees. They blocked wind sometimes. They dripped on you sometimes. They concealed you until they did not. They gave deadwood if you could find it, and trouble if someone saw you take it. They held snow on branches until it fell down the back of your neck at precisely the wrong spiritual moment. Nature was not morally aligned. It was available, dangerous, indifferent, and useful by turns. That is why historical caution does not weaken the story. It improves it. If we admit what we do not know, the world becomes more interesting, not less. We do not know exactly where every fugitive slept. We do not know how many nights a particular man spent under branches before capture or escape. We do not know every hidden helper, every theft, every bargain, every moment of mercy that left no written trace. We do not know whether one hungry outlaw on one particular night wept from cold, laughed with companions, cursed God, prayed, planned revenge, or thought about nothing except his feet. But we know enough to see the pressures. We know medieval outlawry could be a serious legal condition. We know forest law made certain landscapes intensely political. We know rural people depended on access to fuel, food, animals, paths, and seasonal labour. We know winter made exposure dangerous. We know food storage mattered. We know communities were watchful and interconnected. We know legends later transformed rough, fugitive survival into cleaner moral drama. And from those pieces, handled carefully, a colder, more human picture emerges. The danger is filling the gaps too confidently. A cheap version of this story would say, outlaws built this exact type of shelter, ate this exact meal, used this exact trick, and survived every winter by secret medieval techniques. That sounds satisfying. It is also too neat. The evidence does not permit that kind of certainty across regions, centuries, classes, and circumstances. A man hiding in a royal forest in 13th century England was not identical to a border raider, a noble rebel, a poor poacher, a runaway servant, a pardoned criminal, or a later literary hero. The word outlaw covers more weather than one cloak can hold. So the honest reconstruction must remain conditional. Some may have relied on kin, some on theft, some on violence, some on charity, some on sympathetic communities, some on remoteness, some on official corruption or indifference, some on moving beyond the reach of those who knew them. Some probably died unnamed, not because a dramatic chase caught them, but because cold, hunger, sickness or injury slowly removed their choices. Some may have re-entered society through pardon, sanctuary, service, exile, or a change of name. Some became stories. Most became nothing we can hear clearly. There is humility in that silence. The dead poor are often quiet in the record unless they cause trouble for someone with writing materials. That does not mean their lives lack detail. It means the archive was not built for them. A lord's grant survives. A court's accusation survives. A monastery's account may survive. A ballad survives because people kept singing it. But the exact arrangement of leaves under a fugitive's sleeping body, the whispered argument over whether to feed him, the taste of cold pottage eaten in the dark, these usually vanish. The historian stands at the edge of that vanishing and must not pretend to see more than the light allows. Yet imagination still has a role if it behaves itself. It can connect known pressures to plausible human experience. It can translate law into cold hands, property into firewood, reputation into a door opened only a crack. It can make the past audible without pretending to possess every word spoken there. Good historical storytelling is not the opposite of accuracy. It is accuracy given breath. The legends did something similar, but with different loyalties. They gave breath to grievance, hope, and laughter. They made the outlaw quick, generous, and difficult to capture because audiences wanted the world to contain such a person. They turned forest law into farce, officials into targets, and hunger into justice. They did not preserve winter exactly. They preserved the feeling that some rules deserved to be tricked. That feeling was not invented from nothing. If access to deer, timber, pasture, and land was controlled by power, then a story about someone slipping through that control had emotional truth, even when its details were embroidered. If sheriffs and officials could be resented, then making them look foolish was a pleasure with roots. If poor people knew the difference between law and fairness, then an outlaw who stole from the rich and gave to the poor was not merely entertainment. He was a correction the real world rarely supplied. But the correction was too clean for winter. Winter reintroduces the mud. It reminds us that stealing from the rich was harder than singing about it, that giving to the poor required having surplus, that hiding in the forest was less a political philosophy than a daily argument with moisture, that merry companions would have had coughs, quarrels, and probably lice, that a sheriff mocked in song may have been ridiculous, but a local search in February could still frighten everyone involved. The myth is green because people needed it green. The history is brown, grey, white and black, mud, bark, frost, ash. And somewhere between them stands the outlaw we are trying to see. Not the one purified by later romance, not the one flattened by official accusation. A colder figure, a person made of choices under pressure, capable of harm, capable of being harmed, dependent on people he endangered, hunted by systems that were themselves imperfect, remembered by stories that improved him because reality was not generous enough. That is why the smoke remains the better motif than the bow. A bow belongs too easily to legend. Smoke belongs to survival. Smoke is warmth becoming evidence. It is the body's need rising into public air. It blurs outlines, stings eyes, carries smell, betrays location, and then disappears before anyone can hold it. It is visible and vanishing at once, like so much of the poor person's past. By the time later singers gave the outlaw green leaves again, the smoke had already thinned. But if we look carefully in the cold, we can still see where it must have been. If we look carefully in the cold, we can still see where it must have been, and then, oddly, we can see it much closer to ourselves than expected. Not because modern life is secretly medieval, that is usually a lazy comparison, and the Middle Ages deserve better than being turned into a gloomy mirror every time someone wants to complain about paperwork. We do not live under forest law. Most of us do not worry that gathering firewood in the wrong legal landscape will place us in conflict with royal hunting privilege. We do not, thankfully, have to judge whether a church door might be our last legal shelter before exile. But the emotional shape has survived. We still understand what it means for survival to depend on systems that do not feel personal until they touch the body. We understand the difference between a rule written somewhere far away and the moment that rule becomes rent, food, heat, paperwork, debt, permission, a closed door, or a person asking why you are there. We understand, in quieter ways, how quickly independence becomes fiction when warmth, shelter, and food are controlled by other people. That is why the outlaw myth never really dies. It keeps returning because it answers a wish that respectable society rarely admits. The wish is not simply to commit crime. That is too flat, too childish. The deeper wish is to imagine a person who escapes humiliation, someone who refuses a rigged game, someone who walks into the woods and comes back laughing, someone who lives outside the rules without being crushed by weather, hunger, or consequence. Someone who proves that cleverness can make power look stupid. It is a delicious fantasy, because ordinary life often offers the opposite. Ordinary life is full of rules that must be obeyed, even when they are foolish, fees that must be paid, even when they are cruel, forms that must be filled, even when no one seems to read them, doors that open for some people faster than others, and systems that explain themselves in calm language while making bodies anxious. The medieval outlaw, polished by memory, gives that frustration a cloak, a bow, and a better exit. The historical outlaw gives it wet shoes. That is why the winter version matters. It does not destroy the myth only to be clever. It puts weight back into it. It lets us understand why people needed the myth in the first place. A fantasy of woodland freedom is most powerful when real woodland life was miserable. A tale of stealing from the rich matters more when access to land, animals, fuel, and food was unequal. A laughing sheriff in a ballad is funnier when actual officials could make poor households nervous simply by asking the right questions. The legend is not false because people lied. It is beautiful because reality was insufficient. Reality gave people hardship, hierarchy, and cold. Story gave them reversal. In the story, the outlaw knows the forest better than the officials. In the story, the poor recognize justice even when the courts do not. In the story, the clever body escapes the armored system. In the story, hunger becomes generosity after one quick robbery and a witty exchange. In the story, the trees shelter the right people. Real winter was more rude. It asked what justice tastes like when it has to be cooked. It asked who baked the bread being redistributed. It asked whether the poor household could afford to admire the outlaw after losing a hen. It asked whether a hidden camp could stay merry after 3 nights of sleet. It asked how much rebellion fits inside a stomach that has not been full for days. It asked whether being outside the law was still freedom when every warm room belonged to someone else. And that question echoes. Across centuries, people continue to romanticize escape from systems while underestimating the cost of losing systems entirely. The road seems freer than the village until you need a bed. The wilderness seems freer than the field until you need bread. Living outside authority seems freer than obedience until you need protection from someone stronger, rougher, hungrier, or simply luckier than you. Human beings do not survive by independence alone. We survive through arrangements, and arrangements always create power. That is the uncomfortable modern echo. Every shelter has terms. The medieval outlaws' terms were harsher and more visible. A barn, a church, a cousin's door, a monastery gate, a forest hollow, a small fire under branches. Each offered survival with conditions attached. Today the conditions look different, but the underlying lesson remains recognizable. To need warmth is to need access. To need access is to encounter rules. To encounter rules is to discover who wrote them, who benefits from them, who can bend them, and who freezes when they hold firm. The outlaw stands at that discovery point. He is not outside society in the way the legend wants him to be. He is where society's edges become visible. Most people inside the village do not have to think every day about who owns dead wood, who controls deer, who can search a house, who must answer a summons, who can risk feeding a fugitive, who can afford silence. The outlaw has to think about all of it because his life depends on the seams. That is why he makes such a powerful historical figure. He shows the outline of the world by pressing against it. Like smoke revealing a draught in a room, the outlaw reveals where power moves. He reveals that forests were legal spaces. He reveals that villages were surveillance systems as well as communities. He reveals that family could be protection and vulnerability. He reveals that charity had limits, that hunger had politics, that cold could enforce hierarchy more quietly than a guard. He reveals that law did not end at the courtroom. It travelled in wood, meat, bread, paths, and names. And he also reveals something about storytelling itself. We like people who escape. We like them so much that we improve them after the fact. We trim away their uglier choices. We give them cleaner enemies. We make their friends loyal, their jokes sharper, their motives generous, their bodies less tired. We let them live in the green season because green leaves are easier to love than dirty snow. We turn discomfort into adventure because adventure is discomfort with the boredom edited out. But if we restore the boredom, the story becomes more human. The waiting matters. The damp matters. The repeated search for food matters. The fear of a dog barking matters. The awkward debt of being helped matters. The shame of returning to a door matters. The danger pushed onto women, children, kin, neighbours, and poor households matters. These details do not make the story smaller. They make it large enough to include the people who usually vanish behind the hero. The outlaw legend asks, what if a man could live free in the forest? The winter history answers, what did freedom cost everyone nearby? That is the changed perception. Not that the myth is silly, not that the outlaw was always villain or always victim, but that freedom, in this context, was not a clean personal condition, it was a shifting burden. The outlaw carried some of it on his own back in wet wool and bad shoes. Other people carried it in silence, missing food, nervous glances, official questions, and doors opened after dark. Once seen that way, the forest changes. It is no longer just a backdrop for rebellion. It becomes a borderland where law, hunger, weather, and memory argue over one body. The bare trees are not romantic, they are witnesses. The snow is not decoration, it is record. The deer is not merely game, it is privilege walking. The bread is not only food, it is risk made edible. The fire is not only warmth, it is evidence with a pulse. That pulse is what survived in legend, even when the cold was forgotten. People remembered that something unjust lived in the official world. They remembered, or imagined, that someone could answer it from the trees. They remembered laughter because laughter is easier to pass down than frostbite. They remembered generosity because generosity makes a better song than theft from frightened neighbours. They remembered greenwood because winter was too honest. But honesty has its own strange beauty. Under the romance, beneath the leaves, behind the ballad, there is a man trying to stay warm without being seen. Around him is a community trying to decide how much danger a human life is worth. Above them all is a system of property, law, and status that turns wood into privilege, meat into offence, silence into risk, and mercy into something that must be smuggled. That is not as cheerful as the legend. It is better history. Better history is rarely kinder than legend, but it is often more generous to the people legend forgets. It lets us see the outlaw without polishing him into a saint, or flattening him into a criminal shape cut from legal parchment. It lets us see the people around him too, which may be more important by the end. The woman who counts bread twice. The child who knows not to mention footsteps. The neighbour who has decided silence is safer than truth, at least until morning. The forester who is not simply a villain in a feathered hat, but a man inside his own chain of duty, resentment, fear, pay, and reputation. The poor traveller who loses a cloak and spends the rest of the road shivering. The monk's servant who leaves a bowl near a side door and never says why. The outlaw is the visible flame, the community is the smoke. And the closer we come to the end of this winter, the clearer it becomes that survival was never one person's private achievement. A man might boast, if he lived long enough to boast, that he endured the forest. But the forest alone did not sustain him. People did, even when he stole from them, even when they feared him, even when they cursed him, even when they helped only by failing to look too closely. The entire social world remained present in every hidden mouthful. This does not make the story gentle, it makes it responsible. Because a romantic outlaw tale can accidentally turn hardship into scenery. It can make cold seem crisp, hunger seem slimming, danger seem exciting, and poverty seem morally clarifying. Real poverty is not clarifying. It is confusing. It crowds the mind. It makes the decent choice harder to locate and harder to afford. It can make a person both harmed and harmful. It can make a household merciful on Monday and furious by Friday. It can turn a loaf of bread into an ethical crisis with a crust. Winter was the great enemy of clean categories. The fugitive might be guilty and desperate. The official might be lawful and cruel. The villager might be compassionate and afraid. The forest might be shelter and trap. The church might be refuge and removal. The deer might be privilege and meat. The road might be escape and exposure. Every object in this story carries two meanings, because every object exists inside pressure. That may be the final insight building beneath the branches. The outlaw's world was not divided between freedom and law, forest and village, good, poor and bad authorities. It was divided between people with more room to survive and people with less. Room is not a dramatic historical word, but it should be. The rich had more room, more literal room in houses and halls, but also more room for mistakes, for negotiation, for storage, for legal influence, for being inconvenient without immediately becoming desperate. A wealthy household could lose a portion of food and remain a household. A poor household could lose the same portion and feel winter lean harder against the door. A noble fugitive might have room in the form of allies, horses, letters, bargaining power, and the possibility that his rebellion was politics rather than mere crime. A poor outlaw had less room between hunger and theft, between cold and exposure, between asking and endangering. When we talk about medieval survival, this is what we are really measuring. Room between the body and disaster. The outlaw had very little of it. His cloak gave him some room against the wind. His knowledge gave him some room against pursuit. A helper gave him some room against hunger. A church door might give him some room against immediate violence. A pardon, if one became possible, might give him room to re-enter the world. But each margin was narrow, temporary, and borrowed. Nothing belonged securely to him except the body that was slowly being spent. This is why the smoke from the hidden fire has kept returning. It is the perfect, fragile margin. Too little fire, and the body loses. Too much, and secrecy loses. The outlaw must keep just enough heat to remain alive, and just little enough evidence to remain unfound. That is not only a campfire problem, it is the whole condition of his life. Need must be visible enough to receive help, invisible enough to avoid punishment, small enough not to offend, urgent enough not to be ignored. Many poor people throughout history have lived inside some version of that rule. Not as outlaws, not in forests, not under medieval law, but in the exhausting art of needing without becoming too noticeable. Need, when seen by the wrong person, can be judged. Need, when unseen by everyone, can kill. So people learn to manage its appearance. They learn how much to ask for, how much to hide, when to look proud, when to look humble, when to speak, when to vanish, when to make suffering legible, and when to keep it from becoming ammunition. The medieval outlaw is an extreme version of that human problem. He stands where need has become legally dangerous. and because he stands there, the world around him is revealed with unusual sharpness. The village is not just a quaint community, it is care and surveillance braided together. The forest is not just nature, it is law, labour, privilege, and risk growing under branches. The church is not just holiness, it is sanctuary, procedure, authority, and exile. The road is not just movement, it is suspicion, weather, trade, robbery, and rumour. Bread is not just bread, it is stored labour. Firewood is not just firewood, it is property becoming heat. Once this becomes visible, the outlaw legend can be loved differently. We do not have to throw away the old pleasure of the clever fugitive humiliating the pompous official. There is a reason those scenes endured. There is a reason audiences have always enjoyed watching arrogance step into a trap. A sheriff made foolish in the greenwood is one of civilization's healthier little desserts. But we can enjoy the legend without mistaking it for the whole meal. We can let the song be a song and still remember the person who had to sleep somewhere after the singing stopped. That person may never have been Robin Hood. He may have been a man whose name appears once in a record and then vanishes. He may have been one of many. He may have harmed people. He may have been harmed first. He may have survived winter or failed before Candlemas. He may have been caught on a road, hidden by kin, starved in a hollow, pardoned, exiled, or absorbed into another community under a name no one bothered to preserve. History does not owe us narrative satisfaction, and often refuses to pay. But it gives us enough to understand the pressure. So, if we return one last time to the winter wood, we should not return as tourists looking for adventure. We should arrive quietly, with the romance lowered. The trees are bare. The ground is hard. Somewhere a village is closing itself for the night. Smoke rises from roofs where people still belong. A bell marks an hour that has meaning for everyone except the man who cannot safely answer it. He is near enough to smell cooking if the wind turns, too far to sit openly by the hearth. He is not free in the way the legend promised. He is free only in the narrow, frightening sense that no one has caught him yet. That is a very different freedom. It does not sing, it listens, it counts, it crouches, it studies the path, it chooses the least bad place to sleep, it accepts help with shame and hunger in the same hand, it keeps the fire low, it learns that every warm thing has a shadow, and every shadow has a witness somewhere. The final movement of this story, then, is not toward triumph, it is toward recognition. To understand the medieval winter outlaw is to understand that the edge of society is not outside society. It is where society becomes most honest. The rules show their teeth there. So do the bonds. So do the hypocrisies. So do the mercies. At the centre of it all, the small fire burns lower. The outlaw warms his hands, but only briefly. The ash must be covered before dawn. The signs must be broken. The path must change. The village must wake without admitting it dreamed of him. And the smoke, if there is smoke, must become indistinguishable from mist before anyone with authority learns how to read it. Mist before authority learned to read it was the outlaw's final little mercy, because morning always belonged more to the settled world than to him. Morning brought doors opening, animals being fed, buckets carried, carts prepared, children sent on errands, men stepping into yards and looking, almost without meaning to look, at the signs the night had left behind. A village waking did not need to organise itself into a search party to become dangerous. It only had to resume being observant. Ordinary life was enough. The same habits that kept households alive also noticed what did not belong. So the outlaw had to leave before the world became fully awake. He would press ash over what remained of the fire. He would scatter or hide what could be hidden, though never perfectly. He would listen for the first human sounds and hate how far they carried. He would pull the cloak closer, not because it was warm enough, but because it was what he had. Then he would move. Not into legend, into another calculation. Perhaps toward a safer hollow. Perhaps toward a cousin who might not open the door this time. Perhaps toward a church, if the road and the accusation and the courage all aligned. Perhaps away from the region entirely, toward places where his face meant less and his hunger meant the same. Perhaps toward companions. Perhaps away from them. Perhaps nowhere wise, because winter had reduced wisdom to whatever could be done before the cold came harder. This is where a tidy ending would betray him. A tidy ending would let him become Robin Hood by sunset, laughing, restored, morally clarified, surrounded by loyal friends and grateful villagers. Another tidy ending would punish him neatly, as if every outlaw's winter existed only to prove that law eventually wins. But history is not obliged to satisfy either appetite. Many lives ended without becoming examples. Many wrongs were not corrected. Many crimes were not avenged. Many mercies were not rewarded. Many people simply endured until they no longer could, and then the record either noticed them briefly or did not notice at all. The medieval winter outlaw may have survived. He may have been captured. He may have died nameless under weather. He may have found sanctuary. He may have been pardoned. He may have crossed water, changed name, joined soldiers, returned secretly, become worse, become quieter, or become a story someone improved because the real version did not give enough comfort. That uncertainty is not a failure of the tale. It is the point at which the past refuses to become a toy. What remains certain is the pressure, the cold, narrowing choice, the law turning absence into danger, the forest hiding and exposing at once, the village helping and watching at once, the family loving and fearing at once, the fire warming and betraying at once. Every part of the world did two things. Nothing was pure enough to be safe. And maybe that is why the outlaw image has lasted so long. Not because people truly believed the forest was comfortable, but because they knew society was not. They knew rules could be necessary and unfair at the same time. They knew property could protect one household while denying another warmth. They knew hunger could make good people secretive and desperate people dangerous. They knew officials could be ridiculous, frightening, useful, corrupt, dutiful, and human all in one body. They knew the world was not divided cleanly between the hearth and the woods. The hearth had fear in it. The woods had society in them. Once we see that, the old greenwood fantasy changes shape. It does not disappear. It becomes sadder, richer, and more honest. The outlaw beneath the trees is not simply a rebel against authority. He is the place where authority, poverty, weather, and memory collide. His hidden fire shows us what a society values by showing us what it makes dangerous. Warmth, meat, wood, shelter, movement, silence, mercy. That is why the smoke matters more than the chase. The chase is exciting. Smoke is truthful. Smoke says a body needed heat. Smoke says someone stopped long enough to live. Smoke says dry wood was found or stolen or given. Smoke says the cold had not won yet. Smoke says secrecy was failing, or nearly failing, because need always wants to rise. Smoke is the private body becoming public evidence. And smoke does not care whether the man beside the fire is a villain, victim, fool, father, thief, rebel, poacher, deserter, or unlucky neighbour. It rises for all of them the same way. That may be the most humbling part. The cold strips away the flattering categories first. The outlaw's body shivers like any body. His fingers stiffen like any fingers. His stomach tightens like any stomach. If his shoes leak, rank and reputation do not keep the water out. If he sleeps badly, the next day becomes harder. If he is hungry long enough, judgment thins. The body is not impressed by the story told about it. But stories arrive afterward, because human beings cannot leave suffering alone. We make meaning from it, sometimes generously, sometimes falsely, sometimes because the plain version is too hard to carry. Later voices gave the outlaw sunlight. They gave him wit. They gave him cleaner enemies and kinder thefts. They gave him the forest as a friend. They gave him the thing winter denied him most: room. Room to be noble. Room to laugh. Room to choose. The historical winter gives him less room, and therefore gives us more truth. It shows freedom not as a banner, but as a margin. A little space between capture and cold. A little space between hunger and harm. A little space between a door opening and a household being ruined. A little space between smoke and mist. It shows that survival on the edge was not an escape from dependence, but dependence made dangerous. No outlaw survived the frozen wilderness by becoming separate from the world. He survived, if he survived, because the world still reached him in secret, through bread, through silence, through a warning carried by someone who should not have carried it, through a barn left unlatched, through a bowl placed where hands could find it, through a path remembered from childhood, through a church door perhaps, through mercy that had to move quietly, because open mercy cost too much. And if he harmed others, that too belonged to the same web. The stolen food, the frightened traveller, the missing animal, the household made poorer by his need. We do not honour the past by sanding that away. We honour it by holding the whole cold thing together, the desperation, the damage, the courage, the fear, the unfairness, the selfishness, the tenderness, the law, the weather, the smoke. At the end, there is no merry camp under endless green leaves. There is a winter morning. The trees stand bare. The village begins to stir. Somewhere, a woman lifts a pot and notices the weight of what remains. Somewhere, a man in authority hears a report that may or may not be true. Somewhere, a child keeps a secret without knowing yet what secrecy costs. Somewhere, frost brightens on a path where a foot has pressed the earth too recently. And under the branches, the outlaw is already moving. Behind him, the place where the fire burned has been covered with ash and leaf litter, but not perfectly. Nothing human is ever hidden perfectly. A faint warmth remains in the ground. A thread of smoke, or maybe only mist, loosens itself into the pale air and disappears before it can decide what it is. That is the image to keep. Not the outlaw triumphant, not the outlaw condemned. Just one small warmth in a frozen world, made possible by danger, need, silence, and someone's mercy. He was never outside society. He was only where society's smoke became hardest to ignore.